This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. At a will reading at the family attorney's office, a parent figure said, "You don't belong here." I only said, "Okay." The word came out softer than I expected. Not defiant, not broken, just factual. Like I was confirming a dentist appointment. The room smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. There were framed certificates on the wall, heavy cream paper with gold seals that caught the light. I noticed details like that because I'm a photographer. I always notice what everyone else ignores. That's probably how I survived my family. Joseph Garcia stood near the end of the long mahogany table, one hand resting on the back of Charlotte's chair. He wasn't my father by blood, but he'd married my mother when I was 9. By the time I was 12, he'd decided who mattered. Charlotte Harris, my younger half-sister, sat straight-backed, pale pink cardigan buttoned all the way to her throat like she was auditioning for the role of grieving daughter. She didn't look at me. She never did when things got uncomfortable. She let other people do the talking. "You weren't close to Aunt Evelyn," Joseph added, smoothing his tie. "This is family business." I almost smiled at that. I'd lived in Aunt Evelyn's guest room for 3 years, but I said nothing. The attorney, Mr. Klein, cleared his throat in the gentle way of a man who charged by the hour. "Miss Jones is named in the document. She is entitled to be present." That was the first crack in the script. Charlotte's lips pressed together. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "She barely visited." Visited. I swallowed. My throat felt dry. I'd bathed Aunt Evelyn when her arthritis flared so badly she couldn't lift her arms. I'd driven her to dialysis at 6 a.m. twice a week for 18 months. I'd sorted her medications into plastic organizers labeled Monday through Sunday, but I barely visited. I kept my hands folded in my lap, calm, observing, the way I do behind a lens. The thin manila envelope in front of Mr. Klein looked almost weightless. Funny how something so small could make everyone's shoulders tense. Joseph's gaze cut toward me again. "You don't need to be difficult, Aria." There it was, the familiar word, difficult. I had learned over the years that difficult meant I remembered things. It meant I asked questions. It meant I didn't forget dates or numbers or promises made in quiet kitchens. "I'm not," I said gently. "I'm just here." Charlotte shifted in her seat. "This is already hard enough," she whispered, like she was the one who had sat up nights listening to Aunt Evelyn wheeze through pneumonia. Mr. Klein opened the envelope. Paper slid against paper. And for the first time in years, I felt something steady inside me. Not anger, not hope. Preparation. Because I hadn't come empty-handed. I'd learned a long time ago that being invisible has one advantage. No one notices what you're collecting. Mr. Klein adjusted his glasses. "We'll begin." Joseph exhaled like a man about to receive what he believed was rightfully his. Charlotte clasped her hands, eyes shining, and I sat very still, waiting. Because what was about to unfold wasn't just a will reading. It was a reckoning. And they had no idea I'd already seen the first draft of this story. But someone else had too, and he was on his way. Part 2. Mr. Klein began in the same tone people use to read flight safety instructions. Measured, neutral, designed not to alarm anyone. "I, Evelyn Harper, being of sound mind." Charlotte sniffed delicately and reached for a tissue. Joseph squeezed her shoulder like she was the widow instead of the niece who posted filtered hospital selfies with captions about cherishing every moment. I watched their reflections in the glossy table surface instead of looking at them directly. Reflections tell the truth. People forget about them. Aunt Evelyn's voice lived in my memory, not in Mr. Klein's reading. She had a dry sense of humor and a stubborn streak that could outlast hurricanes. "Aria," she once told me while I helped her sort mail, "never let someone else narrate your life, especially if they benefit from the edit." Back then, I thought she was just talking about Joseph. Now I wasn't so sure. The will covered the predictable things first. Jewelry to distant cousins, a donation to her church, a small scholarship fund at the community college where she'd once taught bookkeeping. Charlotte dabbed her eyes again when the scholarship was mentioned, though I'd never once seen her visit the campus. Then Mr. Klein paused. His eyes flicked toward me. Joseph straightened. "To my niece, Aria Jones," he read, "in gratitude for her years of devoted care and companionship." The word devoted hung in the air like a challenge. Charlotte's head snapped toward me. "What?" Mr. Klein continued. "I leave the sum of..." Joseph's hand slammed flat on the table. "This is absurd." Mr. Klein didn't look up. "The sum of $125,000 to be drawn from my personal savings account at Crescent Valley Bank." The room went still. $125,000. I hadn't known the number. Aunt Evelyn never discussed specifics with me. She only ever said, "I've made arrangements. You won't walk away empty-handed." Joseph laughed once, sharp and humorless. "There must be a mistake." Charlotte's face drained of color. She promised that account was for family. "I am family," I said quietly. Charlotte flinched like I'd shouted. Joseph leaned forward. "You manipulated her. You were living there. You had access." Access. There it was again. Mr. Klein folded his hands. "Mr. Garcia, this document was notarized 18 months ago. Your aunt was evaluated at the time. The language is clear." 18 months ago. That would have been right after Aunt Evelyn fell in the kitchen and fractured her wrist. The week Joseph insisted I move in temporarily to help since Charlotte was too busy finishing her marketing internship. Temporary turned into 3 years. Unpaid, unthanked, unseen. "You don't deserve that?" Charlotte said under her breath. I studied her face, the faint crease between her brows, the way she avoided direct eye contact when she lied. Deserve. It's funny how that word only comes up when money does. Mr. Klein continued reading, but the energy had shifted. The air felt tighter. Joseph's knee bounced under the table. Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. Then Mr. Klein reached the final paragraph. "There is one additional matter," he said carefully. "Crescent Valley Bank has requested a representative be present regarding an internal review connected to this account." Joseph froze. "What review?" he asked too quickly. Mr. Klein glanced at the closed office door. A knock sounded before anyone answered. 3 firm raps. Professional, not hesitant. Joseph's jaw flexed. "This is completely unnecessary." The door opened. A man in a navy suit stepped inside carrying a thick, organized folder. He didn't look at Joseph first. He looked at me and gave the smallest nod, my pulse steady because I knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, I knew what was inside that folder. Part 3, the man introduced himself without rushing. Daniel Reed, Senior Investigator, Crescent Valley Bank. His voice was calm, practiced, the kind of calm that doesn't need to prove itself. Joseph stood up halfway, then seemed to think better of it. "This is a private family matter." "Actually," Daniel said, placing the thick folder on the table, "it's a financial compliance matter." Charlotte blinked rapidly. "Compliance with what?" Daniel didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he opened the folder with deliberate care. Inside were tabbed dividers, dates, statements, copies of signed documents, receipts. I kept my expression neutral, but my fingers tightened slightly around the strap of my camera bag resting at my feet. I hadn't brought it to take pictures. I'd brought it because it was mine. Solid, familiar. A reminder that I had a life beyond this table. Mr. Klein adjusted his glasses again. "Mr. Reed contacted me last week regarding irregularities connected to Miss Harper's savings account." "Irregularities?" Joseph repeated, too loud. Daniel slid a single sheet across the table. "It began as a routine internal audit," he said. "Large transfers flagged for review. Unusual patterns inconsistent with the account holder's historical spending." Charlotte shook her head. "Aunt Evelyn barely used online banking." "Correct," Daniel replied evenly, which is why repeated digital transfers raised concern. Joseph's gaze flicked to me, sharp and accusatory. "You were living there." There it was again, access. Daniel didn't look at Joseph when he spoke next. "The IP address used for several of the transfers originated from a residence on Maple Ridge Drive." Joseph's jaw tightened. Maple Ridge Drive. Joseph and my mother's house. Charlotte let out a small, confused laugh. "That's our address?" "Yes," Daniel said. Silence fell like a dropped plate. I watched Joseph carefully. Years of photographing people had taught me micro-expressions, the flicker before anger, the swallow before a lie. His nostrils flared, his right hand curled slightly. "That proves nothing," he said. "Aria was staying there before she moved in with Evelyn." "For 3 weeks," I said quietly, "while I packed." Charlotte shot me a look. "Why are you keeping track of that?" I met her eyes for the first time that morning. "Because no one else does." Daniel turned another page. There were also checks written and endorsed by someone other than Miss Harper, signatures that required verification. Mr. Klein's face had gone pale. Joseph laughed again, but it sounded strained. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm stating facts," Daniel said. Between March of last year and October, a total of $92,000 was transferred or withdrawn in ways inconsistent with Ms. Harper's established patterns. Charlotte's breathing grew shallow. That's not possible. It is documented. Joseph pointed at me. She had her checkbook. She drove her to the bank. She could have. I didn't, I said. My voice didn't shake, because I knew something Joseph didn't. Daniel reached into the folder again and pulled out a smaller envelope, thinner than the will envelope, but heavier in a different way. We also received supplemental documentation, he said. Provided voluntarily. Joseph's eyes narrowed. From who? Daniel didn't answer him. He looked at me again, and this time he spoke my name. From Miss Aria Jones. Charlotte's head whipped toward me. You went to the bank? She whispered. Yes, I said. Not for revenge, for protection. Because when you spend years being invisible, you learn to keep copies. Copies of bank statements Aunt Evelyn asked me to print. Copies of texts Joseph sent about borrowing money. Photos of checks left unsigned on the kitchen counter. Dates. Amounts. Patterns. I hadn't known how it would end. I just knew one day I might need proof that I wasn't the villain in someone else's story. Joseph stood fully now. This is a setup. Daniel remained seated. We invited all relevant parties today so the information could be addressed transparently. Charlotte's voice cracked. Dad? Joseph didn't look at her. Instead, he looked at me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look away because the narrative was shifting and he could feel it. But this was only the beginning. What Daniel said next would change everything. Part 4, Joseph's stare felt like heat against my skin. Daniel, on the other hand, felt like winter, steady, unmoved. We're not here to accuse, Daniel said calmly. We're here to clarify. That sounds like accusing, Joseph shot back. Charlotte looked between us like she was watching a tennis match she didn't understand the rules of. Dad, just tell them it was you handling the bills. You always handled the bills. There it was, the family script. Joseph manages. Charlotte shines. Aria helps quietly in the background. Except this time, the background had footnotes. Daniel flipped to another tab in the folder. Ms. Harper added a secondary contact to her account 2 years ago. Joseph's lips pressed thin. I'm aware, Mr. Klein said slowly. That was for emergency access. Yes, Daniel replied. However, emergency access does not authorize unsupervised digital transfers. Charlotte's voice sharpened. So what are you saying? Daniel slid a printed screenshot across the table. Login timestamps. Transfer confirmations. Account numbers partially redacted. The device used was registered to the Maple Ridge address. Transfers were initiated late evenings, between 10:47 p.m. and 1:12 a.m. Joseph crossed his arms. Insomnia isn't a crime. No, Daniel agreed. But misrepresenting the purpose of transferred funds may be. I felt something strange in my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. It was more like oxygen, like the room had windows now. Joseph turned to me abruptly. You think this makes you look good? I'm not trying to look good, I said. I'm trying to be accurate. Charlotte shook her head. You've always been dramatic. I almost laughed. Dramatic? I'd spent years swallowing every unfair comment, every holiday slight, every Charlotte's just more sensitive than you speech. Dramatic would have been screaming 3 years ago when Joseph suggested I move in with Aunt Evelyn because you're better with that kind of thing. That kind of thing. By that, he meant lifting, bathing, cleaning accidents at 3 a.m., sitting in emergency rooms while Charlotte posted engagement photos. Unpaid, unacknowledged, expected. Daniel cleared his throat gently. There's more. Joseph's jaw flexed again. Miss Harper contacted our fraud department 6 months before her passing, Daniel continued. She expressed confusion regarding several withdrawals. The air changed. Charlotte blinked rapidly. She never said anything to me. She wouldn't, I said quietly. Both of them looked at me. She didn't want to believe it, I continued. She kept thinking there had to be a mistake. Joseph's voice hardened. You're twisting this. I'm remembering it, I replied. Daniel reached for the smaller envelope again. Miss Harper asked for printed statements. She requested that certain transactions be reviewed. He paused. And she asked that copies be sent to Miss Jones. Charlotte's mouth opened slightly. Why? I held her gaze. Because I was there. Because I was the one sitting beside Aunt Evelyn at the kitchen table when she circled amounts in red pen. Because I was the one who heard her whisper, I don't understand where it's going. Because I was the one who suggested we talk to the bank. Joseph leaned forward, his voice dropping. You're making it sound like I stole from a dying woman. Daniel didn't blink. I haven't used that word. But you're implying it. I'm presenting documentation. Justice through receipts. I felt Aunt Evelyn's voice in my memory again. Never let someone else narrate your life. Joseph suddenly straightened, as if he'd found solid ground again. Fine, let's talk about documentation. He pointed at me. She had full access. She could have printed anything, altered anything. Charlotte nodded quickly. Exactly. Daniel's expression didn't change. The bank's internal logs cannot be altered by customers, he said, nor can IP registrations. Joseph hesitated, just a second too long, and that's when I saw it, the first crack in his confidence. But cracks don't mean collapse, not yet, because Joseph Garcia had spent years protecting one child and rewriting the other. He wasn't going down quietly, not when he still believed he controlled the story. What he didn't realize was he'd already slipped, and Daniel was about to point it out. Part 5, Joseph pulled out his phone like it was a weapon. I can call my accountant right now, he said. This is ridiculous. Daniel didn't react. You're welcome to consult counsel. Counsel, not accountant. Joseph's thumb hovered over his screen, then lowered slowly. He knew the difference. Charlotte's voice wavered. Dad, just explain it. You always handle everything. Just explain it. I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. She'd grown up believing Joseph could fix anything, that he had answers for every uncomfortable question. I grew up learning he had explanations. Those are not the same thing. Daniel turned another page. There were 3 transfers labeled medical expenses, totaling $34,000. That's right. Joseph jumped in. Her care wasn't cheap. Mr. Klein frowned. Those payments were not processed through any licensed care facility. Joseph waved a dismissive hand. Private arrangements. I spoke before I could stop myself. What private arrangements? His head snapped toward me. You don't need to know every detail. I was the detail, I said quietly. The words landed harder than I intended. Daniel's voice remained level. The funds were transferred to an account under the name CH Marketing Solutions. Charlotte went completely still. That's my LLC, she said faintly. Silence swallowed the room whole. Joseph moved fast then. Too fast. That was a loan. Temporary. She was between contracts. Daniel nodded slightly. Interesting. What's interesting? Joseph demanded. Daniel slid another document across the table. The memo line for those transfers read dialysis balance and home nurse. Charlotte stared at the paper like it might rearrange itself if she blinked hard enough. Dad. Joseph exhaled sharply. It was bookkeeping. I simplified it. Simplified? I repeated. You wouldn't understand how finances work. I did, actually. Aunt Evelyn had taught bookkeeping for 20 years. She made me balance her check register by hand when I was 14. So you'll never be afraid of numbers, she'd said. Numbers don't lie. People do. Daniel folded his hands. Miss Harris, were you aware funds labeled as medical expenses were deposited into your business account? Charlotte's lips parted, then closed. Her eyes darted to Joseph. That's not what happened, Joseph said quickly. It was temporary. I was consolidating accounts. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Consolidating into your daughter's startup marketing firm? Joseph hesitated again, just long enough. Charlotte's voice rose. Dad, tell them. I am telling them. No, she said, shaking her head now. You're not. The shift was subtle, but seismic. For the first time, Charlotte wasn't looking at me like I was the problem. She was looking at him like she didn't recognize the script. Joseph straightened his jacket, regaining that familiar authoritative posture. You're blowing this out of proportion. The money was going to come back. Evelyn knew that. Daniel's eyes sharpened. She reported confusion about those specific withdrawals. Joseph scoffed. She was confused about everything near the end. I felt my pulse spike. That's not true, I said, my voice firmer now. She passed her cognitive evaluation. Mr. Klein nodded quietly. That is correct. Joseph turned toward me slowly. You're enjoying this. No, I said. I'm surviving it. The difference mattered. Daniel reached for the final tab in his folder. There's one more detail, he said. Joseph's shoulders tightened. The last attempted transfer, Daniel continued, was initiated 2 days after Miss Harper's hospitalization for pneumonia. My stomach dropped. I remembered that week vividly. I barely slept. I lived on vending machine coffee and hospital chairs. I was at the hospital, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, We confirmed your location via timestamped security footage from the bank branch you visited that morning with Miss Harper. Joseph's face drained slightly of color. The transfer, Daniel finished, was attempted from Maple Ridge Drive. Charlotte's breathing grew shallow again. Joseph opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You can't prove who was on that computer. Daniel met his gaze evenly. We can. And that's when Joseph made his first real mistake. He laughed, too loudly, and said the one thing he shouldn't have known. Part 6. Joseph's laugh bounced off the office walls like it didn't belong there. This is about that $87,000, he said, shaking his head. You're acting like it disappeared. The room froze. Daniel didn't move. Mr. Klein blinked. Charlotte frowned. 87? I felt it before I understood it. The slip. Daniel closed the folder slowly, almost gently. The total under review, he said carefully, is $92,000. Joseph's mouth remained slightly open, just a fraction too long. He recovered quickly. Rough estimate. Daniel's tone didn't change. We haven't publicly disclosed the cumulative figure beyond this room, and I have not previously met you, Mr. Garcia. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was heavy. Charlotte's voice came out thin. Dad, how did you know the number? Joseph snapped. Because I manage finances. Because I'm not incompetent. You just said it was 34 for medical, Charlotte shot back. Now it's 87. Which is it? I watched the way Joseph's jaw flexed, the way his eyes flicked toward the door, then toward me. Calculating. Rewriting. He had always been quick with words. That's how he built his authority in our house. If something didn't make sense, he'd drown it in explanation until everyone felt small for asking. But numbers are stubborn. Daniel reopened the folder. The internal audit flagged $92,000 in questionable activity. We began the review before Miss Harper's passing. After her death, we were legally obligated to continue. Joseph scoffed again, but there was less force behind it now. This is harassment. It's compliance, Daniel corrected. Charlotte turned toward me slowly. Her eyes were glossy, but not in the performative way from earlier. You knew about this? Yes, I said. For how long? 6 months. Her expression shifted from shock to something closer to betrayal. And you didn't tell us? I swallowed. I tried. Joseph barked out a bitter laugh. You tried? I told you Aunt Evelyn was confused about missing money, I said, looking directly at him now. You told me she was old and paranoid. Charlotte's face paled further. I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. I told you I was going to the bank with her. You said I was overstepping. That's because you were, Joseph snapped. Daniel interjected quietly. Miss Harper requested Miss Jones' presence during her meetings. Mr. Klein nodded. I can confirm that. The walls Joseph had built over years, carefully, brick by brick, were starting to shift. And for the first time, Charlotte looked unsure which side she was standing on. Joseph leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was trying to regain control through intimidation. You think this makes you righteous, Aria? Running to the bank behind my back? I felt the old reflex rise in me, the urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, but something steadier anchored me. I didn't run, I said. I documented. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me briefly. Respect, maybe. I didn't know what was happening, I continued, and I didn't want to accuse anyone. I just needed records, in case someday someone tried to say I did it. Joseph's head snapped up. So you planned this? No, I said softly. I protected myself. The difference hung there. Charlotte whispered, almost to herself, You thought we'd blame you. I gave a small, humorless smile. Wouldn't you have? She didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Daniel slid one final document across the table. Mr. Garcia, we also have metadata from the device used in the final transfer attempt. Joseph's fingers tightened against the table's edge. It was logged under a user profile labeled J. Garcia. The words landed without drama, but they landed. Charlotte's breath hitched. Joseph's voice hardened. Anyone could type a username. Daniel nodded slightly, which is why we also reviewed keystroke cadence analysis. Mr. Klein looked impressed despite himself. Daniel continued, The typing rhythm matched your prior verified banking sessions. Joseph went very still. Charlotte looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under her, and I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about narrative control. For years, Joseph had told Charlotte who I was. Difficult, emotional, dramatic. Now the receipts were telling a different story. Joseph straightened slowly, voice shifting into something colder. Even if funds were temporarily moved, it was family money. Daniel didn't blink. It was Miss Harper's money. Joseph's gaze darted to Charlotte, and for the first time, she didn't immediately defend him. The first climax wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was quiet. It was the sound of a story collapsing under its own weight. But Joseph Garcia wasn't finished, because when cornered, he didn't retreat. He doubled down, and what he said next would change everything again. Part 7, Joseph inhaled slowly like a man about to deliver a sermon. "Fine," he said. "You want honesty? I moved the money." Charlotte flinched. "But not for me," he added quickly. "For this family." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just watched. Joseph paced once behind his chair, the performance shifting into something almost noble. Evelyn didn't understand how fast her medical costs were rising. Insurance delays, billing errors, I was protecting her from stress. "By transferring funds into Charlotte's business account?" Daniel asked mildly. "It was a bridge," Joseph snapped. "Short-term liquidity." Charlotte's voice trembled. "You told me that deposit was from a new client." Joseph didn't look at her. "It was easier that way." The sentence lingered in the air, ugly and small. Easier that way. For who? I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. I'd imagined this moment so many times over the past year, not as revenge, but as proof that I hadn't imagined everything, that I hadn't exaggerated the way conversations twisted around me. Joseph turned to me abruptly. "And you?" Acting like some martyr, living there rent-free. Rent-free. The words stung, even though I'd expected them. "I offered to pay," I said quietly, and Evelyn refused. "You benefited," he insisted. "You built your photography portfolio off that house. You used her." I almost laughed. The only benefit I'd gained was chronic exhaustion and a deep familiarity with pill organizers. Daniel's voice remained calm. "Regardless of perceived benefits, unauthorized transfers remain unauthorized." Joseph's face hardened. It was going to be paid back. "When?" I asked. He hesitated. That split second again. Charlotte noticed it too. "When, Dad?" Joseph waved a hand. "After her property sold." Mr. Klein frowned. "The property has not yet been listed." "It was implied," Joseph said quickly. Daniel flipped a page. "There are no documented repayment plans, no promissory notes, no written consent." Joseph's volume rose. "Because it was family." There it was. The shield. Family. The word used to excuse silence, obligation, sacrifice, always from the same direction. Charlotte's voice cracked. "You used my company. It was temporary. You told me I earned that contract." Joseph finally looked at her. "You did. I was helping you scale." Daniel spoke gently but firmly. "Yeah, intent does not negate documentation." I realized something then. Joseph wasn't just denying wrongdoing. He genuinely believed he was justified. In his mind, money was flexible if he decided the outcome was noble. He turned back to me, eyes narrowing. "You could have come to me." "I did," I said. "You could have trusted me." "I did," I said again, "and you still went behind my back." "I went with Aunt Evelyn," I corrected. The room felt smaller now, like the air had thickened. Charlotte whispered, "Did she know?" Daniel answered. Miss Harper requested the audit remain discreet until findings were verified. Joseph's jaw tightened. "She was confused. She passed her cognitive evaluation," Mr. Klein repeated. Joseph's voice sharpened. "Those tests are flawed." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. Her clarity was documented in writing. Joseph looked at me again, and something changed in his expression. Not fear. Blame. "You've always resented Charlotte," he said. "This is revenge." The accusation hit harder than I expected. Charlotte stared at me, searching my face. Resented her? Had I? I thought about childhood birthdays where her cake was elaborate and mine was store-bought because you're older, you understand. I thought about report cards that earned her praise and mine that earned silence. I thought about the day Joseph told me I was stronger when what he meant was less important. "I don't resent her," I said slowly. "I resent being erased." Charlotte's eyes filled. Joseph scoffed. "Victim language." Daniel closed the folder again, firmer this time. "Mr. Garcia, Crescent Valley Bank will be forwarding this file to our legal department." Charlotte gasped. "Legal?" "This may escalate beyond internal review," Daniel confirmed. Joseph's composure cracked then. "You can't ruin us over accounting errors." Daniel met his gaze evenly. "We didn't create the transactions." The first climax didn't end with shouting. It ended with paperwork. Daniel slid a formal notice across the table. Charlotte stared at it like it might disappear. Joseph didn't touch it. And I sat there, breathing slowly, realizing something profound. For years, I had been invisible. Now suddenly I was documented. But the story wasn't over, because as the attorney began discussing next steps, Joseph leaned toward Charlotte and whispered something that made her face drain completely. And I knew whatever he just said was going to drag this even deeper. Part 8. I couldn't hear what Joseph whispered to Charlotte, but I saw the effect. Her shoulders stiffened. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. Guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. Charlotte had never been good at hiding emotions. She just preferred when they worked in her favor. "Dad," she murmured, barely audible. Joseph straightened and spoke louder, like he wanted the entire room to reset around his version of reality. "There's context you're not hearing," he said, looking directly at Daniel. Evelyn verbally agreed to help Charlotte's business. It was an investment. Daniel didn't blink. "Is there documentation of that agreement?" "She didn't do email," Joseph replied quickly. "You know that." "I do," Daniel said, "which is why verbal claims are difficult to validate." Charlotte's voice trembled. "Dad, did she know the money was coming from her medical line items?" Joseph hesitated. "Just long enough." "It's all the same pool," he said finally. "No," I said softly. "It's not." The room fell quiet again. Mr. Klein adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. "If this becomes a formal investigation, the estate may be frozen pending resolution." Charlotte's head snapped up. "Frozen? What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said gently, "distribution of remaining assets could be delayed." Charlotte's eyes widened. "But what about the house?" There it was, not grief. Logistics. Joseph shot her a warning look, but it was too late. The question had already landed. Daniel took note of it, I could tell. He didn't react visibly, but he logged it somewhere behind his steady gaze. I leaned back in my chair slightly and let the silence breathe. For 3 years, I'd woken up before dawn to check Aunt Evelyn's blood pressure. I'd sat at the edge of her bed while she described dreams about her childhood farm. I'd listened when she admitted she felt embarrassed needing help. Not once did she talk about investments. She talked about independence, about dignity, about not being a burden. Joseph cleared his throat. "This is being blown out of proportion. The funds were accessible. No one was harmed." I felt something rise in my chest then. Not anger, but clarity. "She was harmed," I said quietly. Joseph rolled his eyes. "Emotionally fragile doesn't count as harm." Charlotte flinched at that. Daniel's tone sharpened just slightly. Miss Harper expressed distress over unexplained withdrawals. Joseph's jaw tightened. "She was old. She was aware," I said. He turned toward me fully now. "You've always needed to be the hero." "No," I said. "I just needed someone to tell the truth." The difference echoed between us. Charlotte's voice was small. "If this goes legal, what happens to my company?" Daniel answered carefully. "That depends on how funds are traced and resolved." Joseph snapped. "You're threatening her livelihood." "I'm outlining consequences," Daniel corrected. I noticed something then. Joseph kept saying "we" when he meant himself. We moved funds. We needed liquidity. We were helping family. But Charlotte's face told a different story. She hadn't known the source, and Joseph had just admitted enough to fracture the image she'd built of him. Mr. Klein spoke again. "We will need formal statements from all parties." Joseph stiffened. "Lawyers?" "Yes." Charlotte looked like she might cry for real this time, and for a brief, surprising moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because none of this erased the years. It didn't refund the nights I'd slept on a twin mattress beside a hospital bed. It didn't undo the way Joseph used to introduce me as our artistic one while praising Charlotte's ambition. It didn't change that when Aunt Evelyn fell the second time, Joseph said, "Aria's already there. She can handle it." Unpaid caregiver, unacknowledged daughter, invisible witness. Daniel began gathering his papers, but before he closed the folder, he paused. "There is one more thing," he said. Joseph's eyes narrowed again. "What now?" Daniel looked at me. "Miss Jones provided records going back 4 years." Joseph's head snapped toward me. 4 years. Charlotte's mouth parted slightly. I held Joseph's gaze. "Yes," I said, because I hadn't just started documenting when Aunt Evelyn got sick. I'd started much earlier, back when small inconsistencies first began. Back when I realized being invisible meant no one checked what I saw. Joseph's voice dropped low. "Dangerous. You've been spying." "No," I said calmly. "I've been remembering." Daniel closed the folder completely this time. And those records, he said evenly, don't only involve Miss Harper's account. The air shifted again. Charlotte whispered, "What does that mean?" It meant this wasn't just about Aunt Evelyn. It meant the pattern might be bigger, and Joseph knew it, because for the first time since this began, he looked afraid. Part 9, Joseph's fear didn't explode outward, it pulled inward. His shoulders drew back too straight, his chin lifted just slightly too high. It was the posture he used when he wanted to look untouchable. "What other accounts?" he asked, voice tight. Daniel didn't rush. Several transfers originating from joint household funds were routed through intermediary accounts before landing in CH Marketing Solutions. Charlotte's breathing became shallow again. "My business account?" "Yes," Joseph snapped. "That's normal cash flow management." "For a household?" Daniel asked mildly. Joseph ignored him and turned to me instead. "You had no right to dig into our private finances," I held his gaze. "I didn't dig. You just magically found routing patterns?" "I noticed patterns," I corrected, "because I was the one reconciling Aunt Evelyn's checkbook." Charlotte blinked. "You were doing that?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Since she broke her wrist." Charlotte swallowed. "Dad told me she had a financial advisor." I almost laughed. The only advisor Aunt Evelyn had was a yellow legal pad and a magnifying glass. Joseph's voice rose again. "You're twisting household budgeting into something criminal," Daniel interjected smoothly. "We're not discussing criminality at this stage. We're discussing documentation. Documentation. Receipts, dates, amounts." I remembered the first time something felt off. It was 4 years ago, before Aunt Evelyn moved in with us temporarily after her first fall. I'd been using Joseph's office computer to print shipping labels for a photography client. An email notification popped up. Bank confirmation. I didn't mean to see it, but I did. It wasn't the transfer itself that stuck with me. It was the memo line. Bridge. That word again. Joseph had told Charlotte once that smart people bridge gaps. I'd started taking pictures of statements after that. Not out of suspicion, out of instinct. When you grow up invisible, you learn to trust your instincts quietly. Charlotte shook her head slowly now. "Dad, were you using my company to move money?" "It's not illegal to invest in your child's future," he snapped. Daniel's tone sharpened a degree. "Without disclosure, it may be considered misrepresentation." Joseph rounded on him. "You're painting me like a thief." "No," Daniel said. "The numbers are." Silence settled again. Mr. A. Klein cleared his throat. "If funds were commingled improperly, restitution may be required." Charlotte looked like she might faint. "Restitution? I don't have that kind of liquidity." Joseph cut in quickly. "This won't go that far." Daniel didn't confirm that. Instead, he looked at me again. "Miss Jones, you mentioned earlier you documented communications." I nodded. Joseph's eyes burned into me. "Don't." The word was low, controlled, a warning. But I wasn't 12 anymore. "I have texts," I said. "Emails, screenshots, conversations about moving money temporarily, about not telling Aunt Evelyn until after." Charlotte's face drained completely. "After what?" Joseph's jaw tightened. "After the house sold," I finished. Mr. Klein's eyebrows rose slightly. "The property is part of the estate." Charlotte looked between us rapidly. "Dad, you said the house would cover everything." Joseph exhaled sharply. "It would have." Would have. Daniel made a small note in the margin of one of his documents. Joseph noticed. "You're building a case out of family conversations," he said bitterly. "No," I replied quietly. "You did." Charlotte's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Joseph softened instantly toward her. "Because you worry. Because you would have panicked. I was protecting you." Protecting. He had always been so good at making control sound like love. Charlotte looked torn in half. And for a brief second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who clung to Joseph's hand at school events while I stood a step behind. But she wasn't a child anymore, and she was starting to hear the gaps. Daniel closed his notebook. "We will be requesting formal statements and supporting documents from all involved parties." Joseph scoffed. "You think this will hold up?" Daniel met his gaze evenly. "Patterns usually do." Joseph turned toward me again, voice lowering. "You've wanted this for years." I shook my head slowly. "No, I wanted transparency." "Same thing." "It's not," I said. "Transparency doesn't burn down houses, it just turns on lights." Charlotte whispered almost to herself, "How long has this been happening?" Daniel answered gently. "The earliest flagged pattern dates back 4 years. 4 years. Before Aunt Evelyn's major health decline. Before I moved in, before anyone thought to look closely, Joseph looked at the table now instead of at any of us, and I realized something unsettling. This wasn't a sudden mistake, it was a system. And systems don't collapse quietly, because the next thing Mr. Klein said would make that very clear, and it would drag our entire family into public view. Part 10. Mr. Klein adjusted his glasses again, but this time his hands weren't steady. If this proceeds beyond internal review, he said carefully, there is a possibility the matter becomes part of the probate record. Charlotte blinked. Probate record? It would be documented through the court, he explained. Potentially accessible. Accessible to who? Joseph demanded. The public, Mr. Klein replied. The word landed harder than anything Daniel had said so far. Public. Joseph had built his life on perception, church committees, neighborhood barbecues, carefully curated respectability. He liked being the man people asked for advice. Public scrutiny wasn't part of the plan. Charlotte whispered, like anyone could look it up? Yes, Joseph straightened, defensive energy returning. This is unnecessary escalation. Daniel didn't argue. That depends on cooperation. Charlotte looked like she might cry again. But this time the tears didn't feel performative. Dad, just fix it. Fix it. That had always been his role, and mine? Absorb it. But something had shifted. The weight wasn't automatically rolling toward me anymore. Joseph exhaled sharply. There's nothing to fix. Daniel's voice was even. Then documentation will reflect that. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier silences. It wasn't shock, it was realization. I thought about Aunt Evelyn's kitchen table. The way she'd sit with her red pen, circling numbers slowly. The way she'd look at me over her glasses and say, "It's not about the money, Aria. It's about clarity. Clarity hurts when you're used to blur." Joseph finally sat back down. What exactly are you suggesting? Daniel folded his hands. Voluntary restitution could mitigate escalation. Charlotte's head snapped toward him. Restitution means paying it back. Yes, Joseph scoffed. You're assuming wrongdoing. I'm offering resolution, Daniel corrected. I watched Joseph carefully. His mind was moving fast. I could see it. He was calculating exposure, reputation, leverage. Then he turned toward me again. This is what you wanted. I shook my head. No, I wanted Aunt Evelyn not to feel confused about her own money. Joseph's eyes narrowed. You could have come to me. I did, I said softly. He opened his mouth, then stopped, because we both knew that conversation, the one where I stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "She thinks money is missing." And he said, "She's old. Don't stir things up." Charlotte whispered, "Is that true?" Joseph didn't answer her. Daniel stood slowly, gathering his folder. "We'll be in contact with counsel." Mr. Klein nodded. "We will advise our client accordingly." Client, not family. The shift in language was subtle, but it mattered. As Daniel slid the folder into his briefcase, he paused and looked at me again. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Joseph let out a sharp breath. "You don't know that." Daniel met his gaze. "Documentation usually does." He extended his hand toward me. I hesitated for only a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, professional, not sympathetic, respectful. When he left the room, it felt like the oxygen shifted again. Charlotte stared at the table. Joseph stared at me. "You've damaged this family," he said finally. The old guilt reflex tried to rise, but I thought about 3 years of unpaid caregiving, about missed photography gigs because someone needed to stay home, about being told I was better suited for sacrifice. "No," I said evenly. I stopped covering for it. Charlotte's voice was barely audible. "Dad, did you ever plan to tell me?" Joseph's jaw tightened. It was temporary. "That's not what I asked." He didn't respond, and in that silence something fragile broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Mr. Klein cleared his throat gently. "We should conclude for today." Joseph stood abruptly. "This isn't over." He was right, it wasn't, because consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold. And as we stepped out of that office into the late afternoon light, my phone buzzed in my hand. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, almost. But when I answered, the voice on the other end said something that made my stomach drop. "This is Megan Walters from Channel 8 News. We're following up on a probate filing connected to the Harper estate." Public. It had already begun. Part 11. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping away from the building's front entrance. The late afternoon sun felt too bright, like the world hadn't gotten the memo that something had just detonated in a conference room upstairs. This is Megan Walters with Channel 8, she repeated, professional and steady. We're reviewing newly filed probate documents connected to the Harper estate. Your name appears in relation to supporting documentation submitted to Crescent Valley Bank. We're requesting comment. My heart didn't race. It settled, because this was the part Joseph feared most. Visibility. I don't have a statement at this time, I said carefully. Understood, she replied. If you'd like to clarify your role, we're airing a segment tomorrow evening. Tomorrow. I glanced back toward the building's glass doors. Through the reflection, I could see Joseph and Charlotte still inside the lobby. Joseph was talking quickly, hands moving sharply. Charlotte stood stiff, arms wrapped around herself. I'll consider it, I said and ended the call. When I stepped back inside, Joseph was already mid-sentence. This is exactly why family matters stay private, he was saying. Charlotte looked up when she saw me. Her eyes were rimmed red, but not from theatrics. Was that the bank? She asked. No, I said. Joseph's gaze sharpened. Who was it? Local news. Charlotte inhaled sharply. Already? Joseph's face darkened. You spoke to them. I didn't, I said evenly. They found the filing. Mr. Klein had warned him. Public record. Joseph ran a hand down his face. This is a circus. No, I said quietly. It's documentation. Charlotte looked like she was trying to breathe through something tight in her chest. They're going to say you stole from Aunt Evelyn. Joseph snapped. I didn't steal. You moved money without telling her, Charlotte shot back, a flicker of anger breaking through. That's not nothing. Joseph turned toward her fully. I was protecting you. I didn't ask you to, she said. The words hung between them. I felt something shift again. Not reconciliation, not yet, but awareness. Joseph looked at me then, eyes narrowing. You wanted the spotlight. I almost laughed. I've spent my entire life avoiding it, I said. And it was true. I worked behind a camera. I told other people's stories. I captured their milestones, weddings, graduations, baby showers. I documented joy. Quietly. No one ever asked about mine. Joseph's voice dropped lower. If this airs, you think it won't come back on you? I know it will, I said. Charlotte looked confused. Why would it? Because families don't like gray areas, I said. They like villains. Joseph seized on that. Exactly. But I have receipts, I added. Silence. Justice through receipts. I hadn't gathered proof for revenge. I'd gathered it because I knew one day someone would ask, why didn't you say anything? Now the question was louder. Why did you? Charlotte's phone buzzed. She looked down and went pale. It's already on Facebook, she whispered. Joseph closed his eyes briefly. What does it say? I asked. Charlotte swallowed. Probate dispute involving local business owner's family. They didn't use names yet. Yet. Joseph straightened again, slipping back into crisis management mode. We need a unified statement. There it was. Unified. Which usually meant silence from me. I'm not lying, I said calmly. I'm not asking you to lie. You're asking me to minimize. He didn't answer. Charlotte looked between us. What are we supposed to do? Joseph said immediately, say nothing. I said, tell the truth. At the same time, we stopped. Charlotte's eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was something closer to realization. You two aren't even in the same reality, she whispered. No, we weren't. Because for years, Joseph had curated a version of our family where I was the difficult one. Now the documentation told a different story, and stories, once public, don't fold neatly back into private narratives. Joseph stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. If you go public with this, he said, don't expect to be part of this family again. The threat was familiar. The exile had always been implied, but something inside me felt steady. I was already outside it, I said quietly. His jaw tightened. Charlotte looked at us, sensing the shift. What did he say? She asked. I held Joseph's gaze for one more second before answering. He said it's not over. Joseph's eyes flashed. Because I'd chosen the gentler version, for now. But tomorrow, when that segment aired, the story wouldn't belong to him anymore. And someone was going to ask for a comment on camera. The question was, would it be him or me? Part 12, I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, because I was replaying. When you're a photographer, you learn to study frames. You rewind moments in your head. The tilt of a chin, the half second before someone blinks, the truth that leaks through when they think no one's watching. Joseph's slip about the $87,000, Charlotte's face when she realized her company account had been used, Daniel's steady nod. frame by frame. At 6:12 a.m., my phone buzzed again. A text from Charlotte. "Can we talk? Just us." I stared at it for a long moment before replying. "Yes, we met at a small coffee shop halfway between her apartment and my studio. Neutral ground. The place smelled like espresso and cinnamon syrup. The kind of place where people edited laptops and planned brunches." Charlotte looked smaller without Joseph beside her. She didn't wear pink today, just jeans and a gray sweater. No mascara. "I didn't know," she said immediately before I even sat down. "I believe you," I said. She blinked, surprised. "I didn't know about Aunt Evelyn's account," she continued. "I thought Dad invested from his savings. He said he'd been planning it for years." "Did you ever ask where the money came from?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "No. Honest, for once. I trusted him," she said quietly. "I know." She studied my face like she was trying to see something she'd missed all along. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, letting the heat ground me. "Because every time I tried to raise concerns, I was dramatic," I said, "or jealous, or misreading things." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You thought I'd take his side?" "Yes." She looked down at the table. "I probably would have," she admitted. The truth didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It felt clarifying. "I wasn't collecting proof to expose him," I said quietly. "I was collecting it in case someone blamed me." Her eyes lifted sharply. "Blamed you?" "You know how this works," I said. "I was living with Aunt Evelyn. I had access. If money went missing and I didn't have documentation..." Charlotte inhaled slowly. "You thought we'd think it was you." I met her gaze. "Wouldn't you have?" She didn't answer. The silence said enough. She looked out the window for a long moment. "He's saying the media is twisting it. They're reporting a filing that..." I said. "That's not twisting. He says you escalated it." "I went to the bank because Aunt Evelyn asked me to." Charlotte's fingers curled around her cup. "He told me you were pushing her to question him." I let out a small breath. "That's convenient." Charlotte's eyes filled again, but this time with something sharper than sadness. "Did he really say she was confused?" "Yes." "She wasn't," Charlotte whispered. "No," I said. "She wasn't." We sat in that truth together. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the invisible one across the table. Charlotte looked at me carefully. "If this goes to court, it might not," I said. "If restitution happens..." She swallowed. "He doesn't think he has to." "That's the problem." Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down and stiffened. "It's him," she said. "What does he want?" "He says we need to present a united front before the news segment tonight." There it was again. Unified. Scripted. Charlotte looked torn. "Are you going to talk to the reporter?" she asked. I hesitated. I'd spent years behind the camera. I knew what public framing could do, how a soundbite could twist context. "I don't know," I admitted. She leaned forward slightly. "If you do, don't make me the villain." The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. "I'm not trying to make anyone the villain," I said. "I'm trying to tell the truth." She nodded slowly. Then she asked something I didn't expect. "Why didn't you ever fight harder when we were kids?" The question landed gently but deep. I thought about birthdays, about school plays, about the way Joseph praised Charlotte's piano recitals and called my photography a nice hobby. "I was tired," I said honestly, "and I didn't think anyone was listening." Charlotte looked at me for a long moment. "I'm listening now," she said. The words were small, but they mattered. Outside, traffic moved like nothing was shifting. Inside, everything was. Charlotte stood slowly. "He's calling a family meeting this afternoon." Of course he was. Crisis management. Control the narrative. She hesitated before leaving. "If he asks you not to speak to the media, what will you do?" I looked down at my hands, at the calluses from camera straps, at the years of quiet documentation. "I'll decide what protects me," I said. She nodded once, and as she walked away, I realized something unsettling. Joseph wasn't just worried about legal consequences. He was worried about losing control of the story. And tonight, when the cameras turned on, control might not belong to him anymore. Part 13, Joseph's family meeting, was scheduled for 4 o'clock at his house, Maple Ridge Drive, the same address tied to login timestamps and late-night transfers. I hadn't been inside that house since Aunt Evelyn passed. The air still smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and whatever cologne Joseph used too generously. Some things don't change, even when everything else does. Charlotte was already there when I arrived. She stood near the kitchen island, arms folded tightly, phone face down on the counter. Joseph stood at the head of the dining table like he was about to chair a board meeting. My mother sat quietly near the window. She hadn't said much through any of this. She rarely did when tension rose. Her coping strategy was silence. "Sit," Joseph said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I remained standing for a moment before choosing a chair slightly away from the table's center. Old habits. Positioning. Joseph cleared his throat. "This situation is escalating unnecessarily." Charlotte didn't respond. My mother looked at me briefly, then down at her hands. Joseph continued. "The news segment airs at 6. I've spoken to an attorney. We are not obligated to comment." "That's not the same as choosing not to," I said. His eyes flicked toward me. "We do not need to fuel speculation." "It's already public record," I replied. Charlotte shifted slightly. "Dad, they're going to ask questions whether we answer or not." "That's why we control the message," he said firmly. Control. Always control. "And what's the message?" I asked. He inhaled slowly. "That this is a misunderstanding regarding temporary fund allocation during a medical crisis." Charlotte's head turned slowly. "That's not what happened." Joseph's jaw tightened. "It is a simplified explanation." "It's not accurate," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Are you questioning me?" "Yes," she said. The word didn't echo. It landed. Joseph blinked once, surprised. I felt the air shift again. He redirected toward me. "Aria has been feeding documentation to the bank." "I provided records when asked," I said calmly. "You initiated the inquiry." "No," I said. "Aunt Evelyn did." He waved a dismissive hand. "Influenced by you." I leaned forward slightly. She circled transactions in red pen before I ever said a word. Silence. My mother finally spoke, voice soft. "Joseph, did you move the money without telling Evelyn?" He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "I needed flexibility," Joseph said. "Cash flow." "For what?" I asked. "For stability." "Whose?" Charlotte asked. Joseph's composure thinned. "For this household, for your future." Charlotte's voice sharpened. "You used my company without telling me where the money came from. I told you it was an investment. You didn't tell me it was Aunt Evelyn's medical funds." Joseph's volume rose slightly. "Because you would have panicked." "You mean I would have asked questions?" she shot back. The shift was undeniable now. For years, Charlotte had absorbed his explanations without pushback. Not today. Joseph turned toward my mother. "You see what's happening? She's turning everyone against me." My mother's gaze flicked toward me, then back to him. "She didn't force the bank to audit." Joseph's shoulders stiffened. The 6 o'clock segment loomed in all around. "I've been advised not to speak," he said he said finally, "and I expect the same from you." He looked at Charlotte, then at me. Expectation, obedience, silence. "What if I choose differently?" I asked. His eyes narrowed. "Then you are choosing to damage this family publicly." I held his gaze. "For years," I said quietly, "I was the one protecting this family publicly." He scoffed. "From what?" "From questions." "Yes," I replied, "about why I moved into care for Aunt Evelyn while Charlotte traveled, about why I stopped taking certain clients because someone had to stay home, about why I never corrected the narrative when people assumed I was just helping out. I'd absorbed it, all of it, because family." Charlotte looked between us, her expression shifting into something steadier. "If she talks," Charlotte said slowly, "I won't contradict her." Joseph stared at her. "You don't understand the consequences," he warned. Charlotte swallowed. "I think I'm starting to." My phone buzzed again. Megan Walters. "Reminder, we're live at 6:05. You're welcome to join remotely or provide statement beforehand." Joseph noticed the screen light up. "Is that them?" he asked sharply. "Yes," I said. He stepped closer. "Don't," he said quietly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, it was almost pleading, but it still felt like control. I looked at him for a long moment. At the man who once told me I was strong enough to handle hard things. At the man who decided I should move in with Aunt Evelyn because Charlotte had too much potential to derail. At the man who said, "You don't belong here." Maybe he believed it. Maybe he needed to, but something inside me felt steadier than it ever had. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "Then don't do it at all," he replied. The clock on the oven read 4:52, just over an hour. Charlotte whispered, "Aria." I met her eyes, and for the first time in our lives, the choice didn't feel like it belonged to Joseph. It felt like it belonged to me. And at 6:05, the camera light would turn red. The question was, would I step into the frame? Part 14. At 5:58 p.m., I was sitting in my car 2 blocks away from Joseph's house. Engine off, phone in my hand. Heart steady in a way that surprised me. I hadn't gone back inside after the meeting dissolved into silence. Charlotte had stayed. My mother had retreated to the kitchen. Joseph had stood in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, already strategizing. Control the message, control the optics, control the damage. The thing about cameras is this: they don't care who thinks they deserve the frame, they just record what's in front of them. At 6:03, Megan texted, "We're about to go live. If you're joining, click the link now." I stared at it. For years, I'd stayed quiet because silence felt safer, because I knew how quickly families label truth as betrayal. But silence hadn't protected me. It had just made me easier to rewrite. I tapped the link. The newsroom backdrop filled my screen. Megan's face appeared in the preview window. "Aria, can you hear me?" she asked. "Yes. We're going to bring you in after the introduction. You don't need to discuss specifics under legal review. Just your role. My role." For once, someone was asking me to define it. At 6:05, the segment began. Tonight, a local probate filing has raised questions surrounding the Harper estate and alleged irregularities in fund transfers. While no charges have been filed, a bank audit is underway. The language was careful, neutral, not sensational, not yet. Then Megan turned slightly toward the camera. "We're joined remotely by Aria Jones, who provided documentation during the bank's internal review." My face appeared in the corner of the screen. I almost didn't recognize myself. No dramatic lighting, no studio polish, just me. "Aria," Megan said gently, "what prompted you to step forward?" There it was, the question Joseph feared. "Why did you?" I inhaled once. "Because Aunt Evelyn asked questions about her finances," I said, "and I didn't want her to feel confused about her own money." Megan nodded. "Were you concerned about potential misuse?" "I was concerned about clarity," I replied. "When large transfers don't match someone's established patterns, it deserves attention. Careful, measured, true." "Some may view this as a family dispute," Megan continued. "How do you respond to that?" I held her gaze through the camera. "This isn't about personal conflict," I said. "It's about documentation. When records exist, they speak for themselves. Justice through receipts." I didn't say the phrase out loud, but I felt it. "Have you faced backlash for speaking out?" Megan asked. I hesitated. Joseph's voice echoed in my head. "Don't expect to be part of this family again." "Yes," I said honestly. "Truth can be uncomfortable." Megan's expression softened slightly. "Do you regret coming forward?" I thought about Aunt Evelyn at her kitchen table, about red pen circles, about whispered confusion. "No," I said, and I meant it. The segment wrapped shortly after. Megan thanked me. The feed cut. My phone immediately buzzed. "Charlotte," I answered. "I saw it," she said. Silence stretched. "Was it bad?" I asked. "No," she said slowly. "It was calm." Relief flickered in my chest. "What did Dad say?" I asked. She let out a small breath. "He's furious." Of course he was. "But," she added quietly, "he didn't say you were wrong." That surprised me. "He's saying it's being misinterpreted," she continued. "But he's not denying the transfers anymore." That was new. Shifts happened gradually. First denial, then justification, then reframing. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "I think so," I said. "You look different," she added. "How?" "Like you weren't shrinking." I closed my eyes briefly. For years I had made myself smaller to keep the peace. Maybe this was what it felt like not to. My phone buzzed again, text from an unknown number. "You're brave." Another one. "Thank you for speaking up." I stared at the messages. Visibility is strange when you're used to invisibility. Charlotte's voice softened. "He's talking to a lawyer again." "About what?" I asked. "He says if the bank pushes for restitution, he'll fight it." "Fight it?" "Of course." Joseph didn't retreat. He countered. I looked up at the darkening sky through my windshield. This wasn't over. The first public step had been taken. But Joseph Garcia was not a man who surrendered narrative control easily. And if he chose to fight, he would escalate. The question was, how far was he willing to go? Part 15, by morning, the segment had clipped itself into something smaller and faster. 37 seconds. That's all it took for context to evaporate. Someone had posted the excerpt online with a headline, "Family Member Speaks Out in Estate Dispute." The comments section had already split into factions. "She sounds reasonable. Sounds like a jealous sister." Where's the rest of the story? Exactly. Where was the rest? My phone buzzed again before I even finished my coffee. Joseph, I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. You blindsided us, he said without greeting. I answered a question, I replied calmly. You made it look intentional. It was intentional. Silence, then sharper. You made it look criminal. I didn't use that word, you didn't have to. There it was, the fear beneath the anger, public interpretation. I stuck to facts, I said. You stuck to your version. I stuck to documentation. He exhaled sharply. The bank hasn't filed charges. I know. Then why speak now? Because silence benefits the person with power. But I didn't say that, because hiding makes it look worse, I said instead. He paused. You think you're protecting yourself, he said slowly. I am. And what about your mother? The pivot. Guilt by proximity. What about her? I asked. She's devastated. I closed my eyes briefly. She hasn't called me, I said. She doesn't want to choose sides. I didn't ask her to. He let that sit. Then, lower. You realize restitution isn't simple. I know. You think I can just write a check? No, I said. I think you need to acknowledge what happened. He didn't answer that. Instead, he shifted. The bank is requesting a formal statement from you. I expected that. You're escalating. I responded to an audit. You fed it. I felt the old pattern trying to reform, his voice tightening, framing me as instigator. But something had shifted. I kept records, I said. That's not escalation. He laughed once, short. You've been waiting for this. No, I said. I've been preparing for it. Silence again, then colder. If this becomes legal, it gets ugly. Truth usually does, I replied. He didn't respond, and for a second I thought the call had dropped. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. There are things about you that won't look good under scrutiny either. It wasn't loud, it wasn't specific, but it was a warning. I leaned back in my chair. I don't have unauthorized transfers tied to my name, I said evenly. You lived there, he pressed. You had access. And I documented every interaction, I replied. He hesitated, just slightly, because he knew that part was true. You're tearing this family apart, he said finally. I stared out the window at the early morning light stretching across the street. No, I said. The transfers did that. He hung up without another word. I sat there for a long time afterward. Threats don't always come as shouting. Sometimes they come as implication. I checked my email. 3 new messages. One from Crescent Valley's legal department requesting a formal written statement. One from Megan asking for follow-up comment if developments occurred. And one from Charlotte. He's meeting with his lawyer at noon. He's saying you forced his hand. Forced his hand. I typed back, did I? The 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, I don't know anymore. I put my phone down and opened my laptop instead. There's something grounding about organizing files. Folders, dates, screenshots, bank statements, text messages, years of quiet documentation. I hadn't collected it to destroy anyone. I'd collected it because invisibility makes you vulnerable. Receipts make you stable. As I sorted through the digital archive, I noticed something I'd overlooked before, a pattern in the memo lines. Bridge. Temporary. Adjustment. The language had been consistent enough to suggest planning, and if there was planning, then this wasn't reactive, it was systematic. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Miss Jones, this is Daniel Reed. My pulse steadied instantly. Yes. I wanted to inform you, he sessional but measured, that Mr. Garcia's counsel contacted the bank this morning. And, I asked, they are disputing intent but not disputing transaction history. That mattered. So they're acknowledging the transfers? I asked. Yes. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding slipped out. That's new, I said. It is, Daniel agreed. But, he added carefully, they are suggesting shared responsibility. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. Shared how? By implying you had knowledge and did not intervene sooner. There it was. Shift the blame, subtly. I closed my eyes briefly. I intervened when Aunt Evelyn asked me to, I said. I'm aware, Daniel replied. And I have documentation, I added. Yes, he said. And that documentation is why the narrative is holding. Holding, not collapsing, not twisting. Holding. But this may become adversarial, he continued. I expected that. There was a pause, then almost quietly, you've handled this carefully. I had practice, I said. He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. As we ended the call, I stared at the files on my screen again. Joseph wasn't retreating. He was recalibrating. Deny, justify, minimize, then redistribute blame. The second phase was beginning, and if he was willing to suggest shared responsibility, then the next move wouldn't be quiet, it would be strategic. The question was, what would he try to rewrite next? Part 16, by noon I had a new email. Subject line, request for clarification, from Joseph's attorney. Polite, clinical, strategic. They were asking whether I had ever accessed Aunt Evelyn's online banking portal independently, whether I had ever initiated transfers at her verbal direction, whether I had ever retained physical possession of her debit card. It wasn't an accusation, it was groundwork, shared responsibility. I read the email twice before forwarding it to Daniel and copying Mr. Klein. Then I opened my archive, because this is the part people don't understand about quiet people. We aren't passive, we're observant. 3 folders down, under Evelyn 2023, I found it. A photo I'd taken of Aunt Evelyn's kitchen counter. Not for art, for documentation. The debit card sitting in its ceramic tray, timestamp visible in the corner of the frame. The same date a late-night transfer had been initiated from Maple Ridge. I pulled up my phone's location history. Hospital check-in, 6:12 a.m. to 4:48 p.m. Same day. Receipts don't shout, they wait. My phone buzzed again. Charlotte. He's furious, she said without preamble. I assumed. He thinks your documentation is obsessive. I let out a small breath. I think it's thorough. She was quiet for a moment. Then, his lawyer asked me if I'd ever seen you use Aunt Evelyn's bank account. And what did you say? The truth. I closed my eyes briefly, which is that you printed statements when she asked, that you balanced her checkbook in front of her, that you never logged in alone. Relief flickered through me. Thank you, I said. She exhaled slowly. He's saying you're trying to ruin him. I stared at the wall in front of me. I'm trying to protect myself. I know. Her voice sounded different lately, less defensive, more grounded. He asked me if I'd stand with him publicly, she added, and I told him I'm not lying. That mattered. More than she probably realized. Silence stretched between us. Aria, she said finally, why didn't you ever tell me how bad it felt? Growing up? The question landed softly, because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about narrative. I didn't think you wanted to know, I said honestly. She inhaled slowly. I didn't. The honesty didn't sting. It clarified. But I do now, she added. I nodded even though she couldn't see it. After we hung up, I received another call. Daniel, counsel is pushing the shared access angle, he said. I expected that. We'll need a formal affidavit detailing your involvement and limitations. I can provide that. There was a pause. Then carefully, they're also suggesting you delayed reporting. I almost laughed. I reported when she asked, I said. Yes, he agreed, but they may argue you suspected earlier. He wasn't wrong. I had suspected, for years. But suspicion isn't proof, and proof requires timing. I documented inconsistencies, I said. I didn't accuse without confirmation. That distinction will matter, he replied. We ended the call, and I stared at my reflection in my dark laptop screen. Joseph wasn't doubling down loudly anymore. He was pivoting, refining, reframing. He wasn't saying he didn't move the money. He was saying it was misunderstood, that I overreacted, that I participated by proximity. It was subtle and dangerous, because narratives don't collapse in one moment, they erode, unless anchored. I opened a new document and began typing my affidavit. Dates, locations, conversations, requests made by Aunt Evelyn, her cognitive evaluation, her red pen circles, every detail, not emotional, factual, justice through receipts. Halfway through drafting, my phone buzzed again. Megan. Aria. Quick update, she said when I answered. We've obtained a copy of the probate filing addendum. My pulse steadied. And it references potential restitution negotiations. Already. That was fast, I said. It's public once submitted. Joseph must have filed something. Or responded. Are you covering it tonight? I asked. Yes. I looked at the half-finished affidavit on my screen. What angle? I asked. Financial transparency in family estates, she said. It's broader than just your situation. Broader. That meant this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about patterns. Megan hesitated before speaking again. Off the record, she said, you're not the only person who's called us about similar issues. My fingers stilled over the keyboard. What do you mean? There are others who suspect irregularities in private family transfers. Your segment prompted messages. A chill moved through me. Joseph wasn't a public figure, but he was respected, trusted. If others were noticing patterns, then this might extend beyond Aunt Evelyn. And if that was true, this wasn't just a family fracture, it was a structural one. I ended the call and stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. 4 years of documentation. Patterns, memo lines, consistency. Joseph had thought he controlled the story, but stories don't stay contained once evidence surfaces. And if other people were starting to speak, then this wasn't just about restitution, it was about exposure. The second climax was approaching, and this time, it wouldn't stay inside a conference room. Part 17, the second news segment aired that night. This one wasn't just 37 seconds. It was 7 minutes. 7 long, deliberate minutes about informal family loans and the gray space between trust and oversight. They didn't name Joseph in the introduction. They didn't need to. Anyone who'd seen the first segment could connect the dots. I watched from my couch, lights off, knees pulled to my chest like I was bracing for impact. Megan's voiceover was steady, measured. Financial experts say that when one family member controls access to an elderly relative's funds without clear documentation, it creates risk, not just for the account holder, but for the entire estate. Then they cut to Daniel Reed. He didn't mention Joseph either, but he explained internal audits, flagged transfers, patterns that triggered review, patterns. Then came the line that made my stomach drop. In this case, Megan continued, transaction histories show consistent transfers labeled as temporary adjustments over a multi-year period. Multi-year. The words felt heavier spoken aloud than they had on paper. They showed a blurred screenshot of a bank statement, the memo line visible. Bridge. Temporary. Adjustment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no ominous music. Just facts. When the segment ended, my phone exploded. Texts from extended family I hadn't heard from in years. Is this about Joseph? What's going on? Call me. Charlotte called. I just watched it, she said, voice thin. So did I. He's saying they twisted everything. Did they? I asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. He says the transfers were reimbursements, she said finally. For what? He said he covered medical bills up front. I leaned forward. That's new. I know, because in the will reading he'd said bridge loan, temporary, different language. Now it was reimbursement. Language matters. Dates matter. Narratives shift when pressure rises. Did he show you receipts? I asked. Silence. Then, no. Exactly. An hour later, Joseph posted a statement on social media. I hadn't followed him in years, but screenshots flooded in. I have always acted in the best interest of my family, it read. Any financial decisions were made transparently and with consent. Consent. The word glowed on my screen. Aunt Evelyn had circled transactions in red ink. She had asked me to print statements. She had said, I don't remember approving this. Consent requires memory. My phone buzzed again. Daniel. They're shifting narrative, he said without greeting. I saw. They've introduced the reimbursement claim in their public statement. That contradicts the bridge explanation. Yes, a pause. And that inconsistency matters. There it was again. Dates, language, money details. Slips happen when stories are built quickly. Has he submitted documentation? I asked. Not yet. But he will. He'll have to. I ended the call and opened my archive again. Medical bills, insurance statements. I'd scanned those too when organizing Aunt Evelyn's paperwork. I searched for any payments Joseph had made personally. There were none. Every hospital charge had been paid directly from Evelyn's account, not Joseph's. I sat back slowly. If he was claiming reimbursement, there would need to be evidence of personal outlay, checks, credit card charges, something. Unless he was improvising, which meant he was doubling down. The doorbell rang. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked the camera app on my phone. A man in a navy blazer stood on my porch, briefcase in hand. I opened the door cautiously. Miss Jones? Yes. He offered a business card. Assistant District Attorney's Office. I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding a financial complaint filed this afternoon. Complaint. Filed. By whom? I asked. Mr. Joseph Garcia. My pulse pounded once, hard. And what complaint would that be? He glanced at his notes. Allegation of defamation and unauthorized access to financial records. The air shifted. Joseph wasn't just defending anymore, he was attacking. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. I have documentation of my authorized access, I said calmly. He nodded. That's why I'm here. As he sat down at my dining table, briefcase opening, I realized something. Joseph hadn't anticipated exposure, so he chose an escalation. If he could paint me as invasive, vindictive, unstable. Then maybe the audit would look retaliatory. It was strategic, but it was also risky because formal complaints require evidence, and evidence cuts both ways. The ADA looked up at me. "Miss Jones, when did you first suspect irregularities?" I folded my hands on the table. "I didn't suspect," I said carefully. "I observed." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explain." And as I began detailing dates, statements, and Aunt Evelyn's red circles, I felt it. The second climax building. Not loud, not explosive, but tightening. Because once the legal system enters the room, there's no more social narrative to hide behind. Only documentation. And Joseph had just invited scrutiny. The question wasn't whether I could defend myself, it was whether his new story could survive cross-examination. Part 18. The assistant district attorney stayed at my dining table for almost 2 hours. His name was Mark Delgado, mid-40s, calm eyes, the kind of person who lets silence do the heavy lifting. He didn't accuse, he asked. "When did Aunt Evelyn first express confusion about her account?" "March 12th, 2022, I said. "I have the printed statement she circled." I slid a copy across the table. He scanned it. "Did you ever log into her online banking independently?" "No, only in her presence. I documented dates and times." "Why document?" The question lingered in the air. "Because I'd already been blamed for the things I didn't do," I said evenly. "Documentation protects me." He nodded once, writing something down. "Did you benefit financially from any transfer?" "No." "Were you ever listed as authorized signer?" "No." He flipped a page. "Mr. Garcia alleges you accessed records without consent and provided them to media." I held his gaze. "The records provided to media were part of a public probate filing. The rest were given directly to the bank investigator upon request." "Mr. Daniel Reed?" "Yes." He wrote again. The interview didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like a sorting process, separating noise from fact. Before he left, Mark closed his folder and looked at me carefully. "Off the record," he said. "Filing a defamation claim requires proving false statements were made with malice." "I know." "Did you fabricate anything?" "No." He held my gaze a second longer, then he nodded. "That's what I thought." When he left, the house felt very quiet, not heavy, just still. I sat at the table where my receipts were still neatly stacked and let the moment settle. Joseph had filed a complaint, not a lawsuit yet, a complaint. It was meant to intimidate, to redirect attention, to make me question whether speaking had been a mistake. But something had shifted, because the ADA hadn't treated me like a suspect. He'd treated me like a witness. My phone buzzed. "Charlotte? He called the DA?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes." "He said you hacked into accounts." "I didn't. I know." Her voice cracked on the last word. That was new. "He's scared," she said quietly. "I know. He keeps saying the media is twisting it, that you're twisting it." "Charlotte," I said gently, "did he reimburse anything from his own account?" Silence. "He says he did. Have you seen proof?" "No." There it was again. No proof, just assertion. "I'm not trying to destroy him," I said softly. "I know. I'm trying to stop being the fallback explanation." Another silence. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. "He told Mom you've always been jealous." Of course he did. Golden Child versus Invisible One. It was the easiest script to revive. "I'm not jealous of you," I said. "I don't think you are anymore," she replied. Anymore. That word sat between us. After we hung up, I opened social media again. Joseph had posted a second statement, this one longer. He included numbers, $14,500 in medical reimbursements. Specific, too specific. I opened Aunt Evelyn's hospital billing file. Total out of pocket for that year? $3,842. Paid directly from her account. The number didn't match. Not even close. If he was claiming reimbursement, he'd need corresponding charges, credit card statements, checks, transfers. $14,500 wasn't a rounding error. It was a narrative constructed quickly, and quickly constructed narratives slip. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel, we've received notice of the complaint," he said. "It won't proceed without evidence." He posted numbers publicly. "Yes," Daniel replied carefully, "and those numbers don't align with bank data." There it was, the slip. "When people are under pressure," Daniel continued, "they sometimes overcorrect. Meaning, they add details that aren't supported." I stared at the figure on my screen again, $14,500. It was meant to sound legitimate, precise, but precision without backing is dangerous. "Will the bank respond publicly?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but we will respond formally." He paused. There's something else. My pulse steadied. What? The internal audit expanded. Expanded how? We reviewed adjacent accounts. My breath caught. Joseph's? I asked. Yes. Silence stretched. And? Daniel exhaled slowly. There are overlapping transaction dates. Overlapping, meaning transfers into Aunt Evelyn's account on days funds left his, or vice versa. Patterns, mirrors. I closed my eyes briefly. Is it criminal? I asked. It's irregular, he said carefully. Irregular. Not a conclusion, but not benign. This is moving beyond probate, he added. I felt it then. The second climax cresting, because Joseph hadn't just denied, he'd filed a complaint, posted inconsistent numbers, shifted language from bridge to reimbursement, and now the audit had widened. He'd tried to make me the aggressor. But scrutiny doesn't follow volume, it follows paper trails, and his paper trail was getting louder. By midnight, another notification lit up my phone. A local business forum had shared Megan's segment. The caption read, "Transparency matters, even at home." Comments poured in, some supportive, some skeptical, some asking questions about other accounts Joseph had managed in his advisory role. I hadn't even thought about that. He wasn't just a family member, he handled informal financial guidance for church members, neighbors, friends. If the audit touched adjacent accounts, this wasn't contained anymore. My phone buzzed one last time before I went to bed. A text from Charlotte. He's meeting with counsel again tomorrow. They're saying it's becoming bigger than expected. I stared at the message. Bigger than expected. That's the thing about receipts. They don't shout, they accumulate. And when enough of them line up, the story doesn't just wobble, it shifts. The question now wasn't whether Joseph could control the family narrative, it was whether he could control the external one. And judging by the audit expansion, he couldn't. Part 19. The next morning, I woke up to my name trending locally. Not nationally, not even statewide. But in our county, yes. It's strange how quickly anonymity dissolves. I've spent years behind a lens, weddings, senior portraits, newborn sessions, always stepping out of the frame before the shutter clicks. Now, my name was in captions. Aria Jones responds to defamation claim. A state dispute escalates. I made coffee and didn't check the comments. Instead, I opened my inbox. 23 new emails. 3 were from strangers, 2 from extended family, 1 from my old high school photography teacher, just saying, "Proud of you for standing your ground." The rest were official. Daniel had forwarded an update from Crescent Valley's compliance department. Subject line, preliminary findings, phase 2. Phase 2. I opened it slowly. The language was careful, legal, dense, but the core was simple. Transfers from Aunt Evelyn's account had coincided with deposits into an account registered under a consulting LLC. Joseph had formed 3 years ago. I read that sentence 3 times. Consulting LLC. I hadn't known that existed. The memo lines, still temporary adjustment, still bridge. But now there was an echo. Money leaving one account, money appearing in another. Same day, or within 48 hours. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it wasn't clean either. My phone buzzed. Charlotte, have you seen it? She asked. Yes. I didn't know about the LLC. Neither did I. She was quiet for a long moment. He says it's for tax structuring, she said finally. For whose benefit? I asked gently. He says he was protecting assets. Whose assets? Silence. That silence answered more than her words. He's telling Mom this is all a misunderstanding, she said. I'm sure he is. He keeps saying the timing is coincidence. Timing is rarely coincidence, I replied, especially when it repeats. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and pulled up public business records. Joseph Garcia Consulting, LLC, registered 2 months before the first flagged transfer. Registered address, a P.O. box. Manager, Joseph Garcia. I leaned back in my chair. Patterns aren't loud, they're repetitive, and repetition is hard to explain away. Around noon, Megan texted, "We're working on a follow-up. Are you willing to comment on the LLC?" I stared at the message. This was the line. Up until now, everything had been reactive, defending my documentation, responding to his complaint. But this moved beyond family. An LLC implies structure. Structure implies planning. I typed back, "I'll comment on what's documented publicly." Nothing speculative, she replied almost immediately. That's fair. An hour later, Daniel called. We're seeing increased inquiry, he said. From whom? Other account holders. My pulse slowed, not sped, because this felt inevitable. What kind of inquiry, I asked. Questions about advisory transfers, informal loans, temporary holds. Temporary. The word had become radioactive. Is there evidence beyond Aunt Evelyn? I asked carefully. Not confirmed, he said, but the audit is expanding. Expanding. The second climax wasn't a single explosion, it was widening circles. Joseph had tried to narrow the focus to me. Defamation, jealous sister, unauthorized access. But once financial institutions get involved, it's not personal anymore, it's systemic. That evening, my mom finally called. Her voice sounded older, tired. Why couldn't you just let this stay private? She asked softly. I closed my eyes. Because it wasn't private, I said gently. It involved money that wasn't his. He says you're humiliating him. I didn't post numbers online. Silence. He says you've always resented him. There it was again. Resentment as explanation. I resented being invisible, I said quietly. That's different. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She just breathed on the other end of the line. Your father says lawyers will handle it, she added. Okay. And he says if this goes further, there will be consequences. I swallowed. What kind of consequences? He didn't say. Of course he didn't. Implication works best when it's vague. After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of my living room and let the weight settle. I hadn't wanted this to become public spectacle. I hadn't wanted strangers debating my family in comment threads, but I also hadn't wanted to be the unpaid caregiver quietly absorbing blame. I opened my archive again. 4 years of documentation, not revenge, not a trap, a safety net. Receipts are boring until they're necessary. Then, they're everything. Around 9 p.m., a notification popped up from the county court website. New filing. Joseph Garcia versus Aria Jones. Defamation complaint officially submitted, my name in bold. Petitioner and respondent. It felt surreal. But when I opened the PDF, my breath, because attached to the complaint was his affidavit. And in it, he wrote, I transferred funds on March 3rd as reimbursement for a hospital payment I made on February 28th. Specific dates, specific claim. I opened my billing archive. February 28th, hospital payment processed from Aunt Evelyn's checking account. Not Joseph's. There it was. The slip, in writing, signed, dated, under penalty of perjury. The second climax didn't come with shouting, it came with a timestamp. And if his affidavit contradicted bank records, this wasn't about family narrative anymore, it was about sworn statements. I closed my laptop slowly, because tomorrow, this wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would be irreversible. Part 20, I didn't sleep much that night. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone build a version of reality that can't survive daylight. By 7 a.m., I was already at my desk with both screens open, Joseph's filed affidavit on one, Aunt Evelyn's transaction history on the other. March 3rd transfer, $4,800. Memo line temporary adjustment. February 28th hospital payment, $1,276.43. Processed directly from Evelyn's checking account. No pending charge, no reimbursement gap, no credit card payment from Joseph's accounts in that range. If he had paid something personally, there would be a paper trail. There wasn't. My phone buzzed. Daniel, I assume you've read it, he said. Yes. The February 28th claim is problematic, he continued carefully. For him, I replied. Yes. There was a pause. He signed that affidavit under oath, Daniel said. I know. Bank records do not support the reimbursement narrative. Then what happens? He exhaled slowly. The court will request documentation. If he can't provide it, credibility erodes. Credibility. Not just in probate, not just in public opinion, in a courtroom. Will there be criminal implications? I asked quietly. It depends on intent, Daniel replied. But false statements under oath carry consequences. Consequences. The word echoed differently now. Joseph had warned me there would be consequences if I kept pushing. He hadn't anticipated they might attach to him. After we ended the call, I sat very still. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Because this was no longer about interpretation. It was about math. Numbers don't resent. They don't exaggerate. They align, or they don't. Around 10 a.m., Megan called. We obtained the affidavit, she said. Are you aware of the February 28th claim? Yes. And? It's inconsistent with documented payments. She was quiet for a beat. Would you say that on record? I closed my eyes briefly. This was the line again. Once spoken publicly, it would escalate, but silence would imply doubt. Yes, I said finally. I'll say that documented payments don't support the reimbursement claim. Understood, she replied. An hour later, the update went live online. No dramatic tone, just contrast. Court filing claims reimbursement for February 28th hospital payment. Bank records reviewed show payment processed directly from account holders' funds. That was it, but that was enough. By noon, my phone started lighting up. Extended relatives, old church members, a former client of Joseph's. One message stood out. He helped me restructure some transfers last year. Should I be concerned? Concern spreads quietly at first. Then it compounds. At 2 p.m., Charlotte showed up at my door, unannounced. I opened it slowly. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where the ADA had taken notes. "I read the update," she said. "I figured. He's saying it's a clerical error." "Which part?" I asked gently. "The date." "February 28th? Yes." I nodded slowly. "Then he'll need to produce the correct receipt." She swallowed. "He's looking." Of course he was. Looking implies it exists, but if it existed, it would have been attached already. "You know what scares me?" she asked suddenly. "What?" "That I believed him automatically." I didn't respond. "I didn't even think to check," she continued. "I just assumed you were exaggerating." "I know," I said softly. She looked at me then, really looked. "You weren't invisible because you were quiet," she said. "You were invisible because it was convenient." The words landed gently and heavily. I hadn't expected that from her. Not yet. "He's meeting with his lawyer again," she added. "They're scrambling." Scrambling. That wasn't Joseph's usual posture. He preferred control, measured confidence. But scrambling happens when details don't align. "Mom keeps saying this will pass," Charlotte continued, "that people forget." "Not when filings are public," I said. She exhaled shakily. "What if this ruins everything?" I thought about that. Carefully. "It depends on what everything is." I said, "If everything meant image, then maybe. If everything meant truth, then it was already ruined." Around 5 p.m., Daniel emailed again. Subject, court response timeline. Joseph's counsel had a brief extension to submit supporting documentation for the reimbursement claim. Extension. Translation. They didn't have it ready. Maybe they didn't have it at all. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This was the turning point of the second climax. Not loud, not explosive, but structural, because once you claim specifics under oath, you're locked into them. And if those specifics don't match the record, you don't just lose an argument, you lose credibility. My phone buzzed one last time before dinner, an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Miss Jones," a woman's voice said. "My name is Patricia. I attend church with your father." My stomach tightened. "I don't want to intrude," she continued quickly, "but I saw the segment, and I wanted you to know you're not wrong to ask questions." I swallowed. "Thank you," I said quietly. "He advised my husband on moving funds last year," she added. "We're reviewing things." There it was again, widening circles. When the call ended, I sat at my table in silence. Justice through receipts. It sounds simple, but it's not. Because receipts don't just expose transactions. They expose trust. And trust once cracked doesn't snap back neatly. The court deadline for Joseph's documentation was set for Friday. 3 days. 3 days for him to produce a reimbursement that didn't exist. 3 days before a sworn statement would be measured against bank records. And if he couldn't reconcile the dates, the next phase wouldn't be about family at all. It would be about accountability. Part 21. Friday arrived with the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel suspended. Not storming. Not clear. Just waiting. I woke up before my alarm and checked my phone before my feet even hit the floor. No new filings yet. The court docket wouldn't update until late morning. Still, anticipation has its own pulse. It hums under your skin. I made coffee I didn't really want and sat at my desk, refreshing the portal more often than I'd admit out loud. At 9:47 a.m., Daniel called. "They've submitted something," he said. My spine straightened. "What kind of something?" "A supplemental declaration. Does it include proof of the February 28th payment?" Pause. "No." The words settled slowly. "What does it include?" I asked. "A revised explanation, of course. When documentation fails, reinterpretation begins," I murmured. Daniel exhaled lightly, almost amused despite himself. They're now stating that the March 3rd transfer was part of a broader reimbursement cycle and may not correspond to a single invoice. May not correspond. That wasn't what the affidavit said. The affidavit had named February 28th specifically. That contradicts the sworn statement, I said. "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "It does." he continued. They're framing the initial date as an example, not a precise reference. Under oath, under oath. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't a small adjustment. It was a pivot. And pivots under oath are risky. Is that allowed? I asked. You can amend clarifications, Daniel said carefully. But inconsistencies weaken credibility. There it was again, credibility, the real currency in any legal dispute. After we hung up, I downloaded the supplemental filing. The language was careful, dense, defensive. It now described a pattern of reimbursement activity occurring in late Q1. Q1, corporate language inserted into family finances. And nowhere did it include a receipt. No canceled check, no credit card statement, no invoice paid from Joseph's personal account. Just explanation. I felt something unexpected then. Not anger, not fear, clarity. Because when someone changes their story under pressure, it's not subtle to the people paying attention. And people were paying attention. My phone buzzed. Charlotte, did you see it? She asked. Yes. He says the date was just illustrative. Under oath? I repeated. She went quiet. He's saying the legal language was misinterpreted. It was his language, I said gently. She didn't argue. That was new. I asked him for proof, she said quietly. And he told me I should trust him. Trust, such a fragile word. I trusted him for years, I said softly. That's why I documented. Silence stretched between us. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. I think he's scared now. He should be careful, I replied. Not cruelly, factually, because fear makes people sloppy. And sloppiness in sworn filings doesn't disappear. Around noon, Megan texted, "We're covering the amendment. Any comment?" I stared at the screen. This was becoming a rhythm. Filing, update, clarification, exposure. I typed, "Public documents should speak for themselves." She responded with a thumbs up. By mid-afternoon, commentary online shifted. It wasn't about jealousy anymore. It wasn't about family drama. It was about inconsistencies. Why amend if the first statement was accurate? Where are the receipts? That word again. Receipts. The theme of this whole unraveling. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Because even when truth surfaces, it doesn't repair the years before it. At 4 p.m., Daniel called again. "One more development," he said. I braced. "The ADA's office has requested a review of both affidavits." My pulse steadied. "For perjury?" I asked carefully. "For discrepancy," he replied. "They haven't labeled it yet. Discrepancy. Neutral word. Serious implication. They'll compare filings to bank data," he added. "They already have," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "But now it's formal." Formal changes everything, because informal narrative can bend. Formal record does not. After we hung up, I stepped outside for air. The sky was still gray, but lighter now, clouds thinning. Across the street, a neighbor watered her plants like nothing in the world was shifting. It struck me then how small and large this all was at the same time. Small, because it was about one family, one account, one set of transfers. Large, because it touched systems. Trust, authority, responsibility. My phone buzzed again, a text from Mom. "Your father says this is getting out of hand." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed back, "It was out of hand before anyone noticed." She didn't reply. That night, I didn't check the docket again. Because whatever came next wouldn't change the core truth. Joseph had doubled down, then amended, then reframed. And each shift left a trace. Paper trails don't erase easily. They stack. And as they stacked, the third act of this story began to take shape. Because if the ADA labeled it more than discrepancy, if they called it false statement, then this wouldn't just be about restitution. It would be about accountability. And accountability doesn't negotiate with narrative. It measures it. The only question now was, how much more would Joseph risk trying to protect the image he'd already fractured? Part 22, by Monday morning, the word discrepancy had evolved. Daniel didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way someone says the weather has shifted. Matter of fact, inevitable. The ADA's office has opened a preliminary inquiry, he told me. Inquiry into what? I asked, even though I already knew. Potential false statements in sworn filings. There it was. Not accusation, not charge. Inquiry. But inquiries don't open without reason. Does Joseph know? I asked. Yes. Pause. He's retained separate counsel. Separate, which meant this was no longer just a probate issue or even a civil dispute. It was becoming personal liability. After we hung up, I sat very still. I had imagined many endings to this story over the years. Quiet reconciliation, silent estrangement, a private apology. I had not imagined official review, not imagined the words false statement and under oath circling my family's name. My phone buzzed. Charlotte, he's saying this is harassment, she said immediately. By whom? By you. By the bank. By the media. By everyone. I let that sit for a second. Is he saying the records are wrong? I asked. No, that mattered. Is he saying he didn't sign the affidavit? No, that mattered more. He says the language was misunderstood. Under oath? I asked gently. She exhaled sharply. You keep saying that. Because it matters. Silence. He asked me if I'd testify that he paid medical bills personally, she said. And did he? No, she whispered. The air between us felt different now, less defensive, more raw. I told him I won't lie, she added. Something inside me softened. Thank you, I said quietly. He called me ungrateful, she said. I almost smiled sadly. It was a familiar word. After we hung up, I opened my laptop again, not to search for more evidence, but to reread the first folder I'd ever created. Evelyn Notes, Year 1. It wasn't dramatic, it was mundane. Screenshots, calendar entries, a photo of Aunt Evelyn's handwritten list that read, Ask Joseph about $2,000 transfer. That was it. No accusations, just a question. That's how this started, not with outrage, with confusion. Around noon, Megan emailed. Subject, inquiry confirmed. They weren't naming Joseph yet. But the article stated that the district attorney's office had confirmed a preliminary review into inconsistencies in a civil estate filing tied to a recent local audit. Careful wording, but clear enough. The comments section was different now. Less gossip, more concern. This is serious. Sworn statements matter. By 2 p.m., my mom showed up at my apartment. She didn't call first. She just knocked. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. Can we talk? She asked. I stepped aside. She sat on the couch and folded her hands tightly. He says you've ruined his reputation, she began. I didn't interrupt. He says you could have handled this quietly. I tried, I said softly, for years. She looked up at me then, really looked. I didn't know, she said. I know. And now? She asked. Now it's not mine to control. That was the truth. Once filings are public and inquiries begin, it's no longer about family mediation. It's about record. She swallowed. He says the bank is misinterpreting internal transfers. Does he have documentation? I asked gently. She hesitated. I don't know. That hesitation told me everything. I didn't want this, she said suddenly. I didn't want any of it. Neither did I. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she said something that felt like a crack in a long-sealed wall. Were you really that lonely growing up? The question wasn't about money. It was about the invisible years. Yes, I said. She closed her eyes briefly. I thought you were independent, she whispered. I was alone. The distinction hung between us. Heavy. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table and let the house settle again. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt exposed. Because when family fractures publicly, everyone bleeds a little. At 5:30 p.m., Daniel called once more. One more development, he said. I braced. The court has scheduled a hearing to address the amended affidavit and the discrepancy. When? I asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That will coincide with the probate hearing, he added, which meant everything would converge. The estate, the audit, the affidavit, the inquiry. The third climax was forming now. Not just about transfers, not just about narrative, but about accountability in a room where everything is recorded. I hung up and stared at the calendar on my wall. 2 weeks. 14 days. 14 days until Joseph would have to stand in a courtroom and explain not just numbers, but changes in his own sworn words. My phone buzzed one last time that evening, a message from a number I didn't recognize. Miss Jones, my husband trusted Joseph with informal advice last year. We're reviewing our records. Thank you for speaking up. I read it twice. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even vindication. It was ripple effect. Justice through receipts. Not loud, not glamorous, just persistent. And as the hearing date circled closer, one thing became clear. This story was no longer about whether I belonged in that attorney's office. It was about whether truth belonged in the record. And in 2 weeks, it would. Part 23. 2 weeks sounds like a long time until you start counting it in headlines. By Wednesday, the phrase estate discrepancy hearing had appeared in 3 separate local outlets. No one was shouting scandal. No one was speculating wildly. It was worse than that. They were being measured. Measured coverage makes things feel real. I tried to keep working. I had a newborn session on Thursday, a senior portrait shoot on Saturday. Standing behind the camera has always steadied me. Aperture, light, framing, things that can be adjusted with intention. But every time my phone buzzed in my pocket, my focus slipped. By Friday morning, Daniel called with a tone I hadn't heard before. "They've submitted partial documentation," he said. "Partial how?" I asked. "Credit card statements." My pulse ticked once. "For February 28th? No." I closed my eyes briefly. "What do they show?" "Miscellaneous charges from late March, medical supply store, pharmacy, gas." "Gas?" I repeated. "Yes. That's not reimbursement for a hospital invoice." "No," Daniel agreed calmly. He continued, "They're attempting to establish a general pattern of out-of-pocket spending. Does it total $14,500? No. Does it align with specific transfers? No." I exhaled slowly. So the strategy was widening again, from one date to a vague quarter to a pattern of generosity. The problem with that approach? Patterns require consistency, and their version didn't match the timing of transfers. "Will the court accept this?" I asked. "The court will examine it," Daniel said, "but it doesn't reconcile the sworn statement." Reconcile. That word again. Numbers either reconcile or they don't. After we hung up, I opened the scanned statements he forwarded. Restaurant charges, online subscriptions, a hardware store. Yes, there were pharmacy payments, but none that lined up with the specific transfer dates in question. It felt like someone dumping a drawer onto the table and calling it organization. Around noon, Charlotte called. "He showed me the statements," she said. "And?" "He said this proves he was covering expenses." "Did he highlight anything?" I asked. "Yes, the pharmacy." "Was the amount $4,800? I asked gently. "No." Silence. "He said the totals add up over time," she added, "to $14,500, I asked. "I don't know." She sounded tired, more tired than defensive. I asked him why he named February 28th if he wasn't sure, she said quietly. "And what did he say?" "He said that's what his lawyer told him to say." There it was, the slip, blame shifting to counsel. Even if true, the affidavit carried his signature, his oath. "You can't sign something you don't verify," I said softly. "I know," she whispered. After we hung up, I stepped outside for air. The neighborhood looked normal. Mailboxes, dogs barking in the distance, a kid riding a bike down the sidewalk. And yet inside my family, everything felt brittle. Around 3 p.m., Megan texted, "We've obtained the credit card documents. They don't reconcile," planning to mention that they don't align with specific transfers. I typed back, "Stick to what's documented." She replied with a simple, "Always." By evening, the update went live. No accusation, just comparison. Documents submitted by petitioner include miscellaneous expenses. Court records indicate these do not correspond directly to the previously cited transfer date. That was enough, because it wasn't me saying it, it was public record. And the comments shifted again. Why name a specific date if it wasn't accurate? Why can't he produce direct proof? That's the thing about doubling down. Every time you adjust, you create another point of tension. And tension, when stacked, becomes pressure. At 7 p.m., my mom called again. "He says you're humiliating him by letting the media dissect everything," she said. "I'm not feeding them," I replied calmly. "They're reading public filings. He says you could ask them to stop. I can't control public record." She was quiet. "He's not sleeping," she added softly. Neither was I. But I didn't say that. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and opened the earliest photos I'd taken of Aunt Evelyn's paperwork. Her handwriting, her careful circles, the question marks she'd drawn next to transfers. It wasn't dramatic, it was gentle confusion. That's what started this. Not revenge, not resentment, concern. And now that concern had grown into a court date. 10 days away, 10 days until Joseph would have to explain not just the transfer, but the date, the amount, the amendment, the credit card statements that didn't reconcile. He had tried to paint me as vindictive, as jealous, as dramatic. But numbers are boring. They don't take sides. They just sit there, waiting to be read correctly. My phone buzzed once more before bed. A message from Daniel. One more note. The ADA's office has requested certified bank records directly from Crescent Valley, not copies. Originals, certified, originals. That meant the margin for reinterpretation was shrinking. I set my phone down slowly, because once certified records enter the courtroom, narrative loses oxygen. And Joseph had already used most of his Part 24. The certified records arrived 3 days before the hearing. Not to me, legally they couldn't, but to the court, Daniel called as soon as he received confirmation. "They're clean," he said. "Clean how?" I asked. "Time-stamped, verified, direct from Crescent Valley's compliance division." And they confirm exactly what we've been discussing, which meant no February 28th personal payment from Joseph, no out-of-pocket hospital charge that matched the March 3rd transfer, no reimbursement trail, just movement of funds labeled temporary adjustment. I closed my eyes and let that settle. Because once certified records are filed, there's no arguing interpretation. The numbers are authenticated, sealed, official. They've also included metadata, Daniel added. Metadata? Login times, IP addresses, authorization logs. I sat up straighter, and transfers were initiated remotely from a device registered to Joseph's home network. There it was. Not shocking, but definitive. Was Aunt Evelyn present? I asked quietly. No indication of concurrent access from her residence, which meant the transfers weren't happening in her kitchen while she watched. They were happening elsewhere, without her visible participation. I swallowed slowly. This wasn't about forgetfulness anymore. It was about control. That afternoon, Charlotte showed up again. This time, she didn't knock hesitantly. She walked in like she needed grounding. "They subpoenaed the router logs," she said. "Yes." "He says that's invasive." "It's verification," I replied. She paced my living room. "He keeps saying he never meant to hurt anyone." Intent, such a slippery word. "You can cause harm without intending to," I said softly. She stopped pacing. "He says the money was always going to be replaced." "Was it?" I asked gently. Silence. That silence was heavier than any accusation. Because repayment plans don't undo unauthorized transfers. They just reframe them. I asked him why he didn't just tell Aunt Evelyn, she said quietly. And he said she wouldn't understand. There it was. The quiet justification. Protection, management, control disguised as care. I leaned back against the couch. "When you decide someone wouldn't understand," I said carefully, "you stop asking for consent." She looked at me for a long moment. And for the first time, I saw something shift in her expression. Not denial, not defensiveness, recognition. By evening, Megan called. "We've confirmed the certified records include device origin data," she said. "Are you reporting that?" I asked. "Yes, without speculation." "Good. The hearing's going to be intense," she added. "I know." She paused. "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know yet," I admitted, because strength doesn't feel like victory. It feels like endurance. Later that night, my mom called again. Her voice sounded thinner than usual. "They're bringing up your childhood," she said. I closed my eyes. "How?" "He says you've always felt overlooked, that this is about old wounds." There it was again. Resentment as explanation. I exhaled slowly. "Being overlooked doesn't create bank transfers," I said quietly. She didn't argue. "He says the media is twisting his character." "The records aren't media," I replied. Silence stretched. "I never meant for you to feel invisible," she whispered. The words landed gently and painfully. "I know," I said, "but I was." We stayed quiet for a while. Then she said something that surprised me. "I should have noticed." I didn't know how to respond to that because acknowledgement doesn't rewind years, but it does matter. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and opened the folder labeled Boundaries. I had written it months ago, before any of this went public. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. No involvement in my milestone less invited. No access to my future children without direct permission. Email-only communication for 90 days. Respect for private life. I hadn't known when I'd use it, but I knew I would. Because justice through receipts isn't just about money. It's about pattern interruption. The hearing was 3 days away now. 3 days until Joseph would sit in a courtroom with certified records in front of him. 3 days until the discrepancy between his sworn affidavit and bank data would be addressed under judicial review. 3 days until narrative would be measured against metadata. My phone buzzed one last time before bed. A message from Daniel. One more development. The ADA's office has indicated they may attend the hearing. I stared at the text. They didn't have to attend civil probate hearings. If they were showing up, it wasn't casual. I set my phone down slowly, because that meant the third climax wasn't just about restitution anymore. It was about whether Joseph could explain not just the transfers, but the decision to sign a sworn statement that didn't reconcile with certified records. And once that question is asked in a courtroom, there's no editing, no amendments, no reframing, Just answer. Part 25. The morning of the hearing felt unnaturally bright. Courtrooms always look smaller in real life than they do on TV. Less dramatic. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, a clock that ticks louder than it should. I arrived early, not because I was eager, because I didn't want to walk in after Joseph. Daniel met me outside the courtroom doors. "They're here," he said quietly. "Who?" "Joseph, his counsel, separate criminal defense attorney." Criminal defense. The words didn't clang the way they might have weeks ago. They just landed. "And the ADA?" I asked. "Present," I nodded once. Then I walked in. Joseph was seated at the petitioner's table, suit pressed, jaw tight. Charlotte sat behind him, my mom beside her. For a moment, no one looked at me. Then Joseph did. Not angry, not wounded, calculating. The hearing began without theatrics. The probate judge reviewed the amended affidavit, then the original, then the certified bank records, calmly, methodically. "Mr. Garcia," the judge said, adjusting her glasses, "in your initial sworn affidavit, you state that the March 3rd transfer corresponded to a February 28th hospital payment made from your personal funds. Do you stand by that statement?" Joseph cleared his throat. "That statement was illustrative," he said carefully. The judge tilted her head slightly. "It was specific," she replied. His attorney leaned forward. "Your Honor, the date was intended to reflect a general reimbursement period." The judge raised a hand. "I am addressing the affiant." Silence settled over the room. Joseph swallowed. "I may have misstated the specific invoice," he said. "May have?" the judge asked. Daniel's posture beside me remained steady. The judge flipped to the certified bank record. "This document shows the February 28th hospital charge was paid directly from Ms. Evelyn Harris's account, not from yours." Joseph nodded slowly. "Yes. So there was no personal payment requiring reimbursement on that date." He hesitated. "No." The word hung in the room, clear, audible, documented. The judge's voice remained even. "Why then did you identify that date under oath?" Joseph inhaled slowly. "My counsel advised." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Did your counsel fabricate the date?" His defense attorney shifted slightly. "No, Your Honor," Joseph said quickly. "Then the responsibility for accuracy rests with you." Silence again. This was the moment. Not explosive, not dramatic, just precise. The third climax didn't roar. It tightened. The judge continued. "Your amended filing reframes the transfer as part of a broader reimbursement pattern. Yet no documentation provided reconciles that transfer to personal expenditures." Joseph's jaw flexed. "I intended to repay the funds," he said. Intended, future tense. The judge leaned back slightly. Intent to repay does not negate unauthorized transfer. There it was. Unauthorized. The word entered the record. Joseph's shoulders stiffened. His attorney attempted to pivot. "Your Honor, this was a family matter handled informally." "Family matters are not exempt from fiduciary responsibility," the judge replied calmly. Fiduciary responsibility. Another word that doesn't bend easily. The ADA stood briefly. "Your Honor, our office is observing due to inconsistencies between sworn statements and certified financial records." Observing. Not accusing, but present. Joseph's gaze flickered toward them. For the first time, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, uncertainty. The judge concluded the initial review. "The court orders a forensic accounting of the estate transfers over the relevant period," she stated. "Additionally, this court refers the affidavit discrepancy to the district attorney's office for further review." Referral. Formal, recorded. The gavel tapped lightly, and just like that, it was no longer about narrative, it was about process. As people began to stand, Joseph turned toward me. His voice was low. "You wanted this," he said. I met his gaze evenly. "No," I replied quietly. "I wanted honesty." He looked like he might say more, but he didn't. Charlotte stood slowly behind him. Our eyes met briefly. There was no hostility there anymore, just exhaustion. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, not aggressive, just present. Megan caught my eye. "Any comment?" she asked gently. I kept my voice steady. "Certified records speak clearly." That was it. No drama, no triumph, just fact. As Daniel and I walked toward the parking lot, he spoke quietly. "This is the inflection point." "I know. From here, it's less about perception and more about documentation. Justice through receipts. It wasn't a slogan anymore, it was procedure. When I got home, my phone buzzed. "Mom, he says you've destroyed him," she whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. "I didn't sign the affidavit," I said softly. Silence. "He says he was protecting the family." "From what?" I asked. She didn't answer. That night, as news alerts rolled in, court orders forensic accounting, affidavit referred for review, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about boundaries. And the next part, the part no one was ready for, wouldn't be about money. It would be about what happens when someone who's always controlled the narrative loses control of the record. Part 26. The forensic accountant moved faster than I expected, maybe because the transfers were already flagged. Maybe because certified records make patterns easier to trace. Either way, within a week, Daniel called with an update that shifted the ground again. They've completed a preliminary reconstruction, he said. Of Aunt Evelyn's account? I asked. Yes, and adjacent flows. Adjacent. The word made my stomach tighten. What does that mean? I asked quietly. It means funds transferred from her account were routed into the consulting LLC and then redistributed. Redistributed where? Pause. Partial mortgage payments, credit card balances, business expenses, not hospital bills, not reimbursements. Joseph's obligations. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Is that interpretation or confirmed? I asked. Confirmed by matching amounts and timestamps, Daniel said. The flows reconcile. Reconcile, that word again. Only now, it worked against him. Because reconciliation doesn't just expose absence, it maps direction. My hands felt cold. Total amount? I asked. Over the reviewed period? Just under 62,000. 62,000. I closed my eyes. That wasn't a bridge. That wasn't rounding error. That was systematic. They've also identified 3 additional transfers not previously flagged, Daniel added. Why weren't they flagged? They were under internal reporting thresholds. Smaller, more frequent, strategic. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. This wasn't impulsive, it was structured. Will this be presented at the next hearing, I asked. Yes. And the ADA? They've requested a copy. Of course they had. When money flows align with personal obligations, intent becomes harder to soften. That evening, Megan called. We've confirmed the forensic review found routed transfers, she said. Yes. Do you want to comment? I paused. Every word now mattered. I'll say this, I replied carefully. Documentation shows patterns. Patterns deserve explanation. She didn't push. She didn't need to. By nightfall, the update ran. Not sensational, just precise. Forensic accounting reveals routed transfers into consulting entity tied to petitioner. The comments changed again, less sympathy, more gravity. Because when money is routed into personal obligations, it stops sounding like confusion. My phone buzzed. Charlotte. He says the LLC was a holding account, she said. For what? I asked. For managing temporary liquidity. I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat. Did Aunt Evelyn authorize that structure? I asked gently. Silence. No, there it was. The thing no one wanted to say out loud. Authorization. Without it, liquidity is just a euphemism. He says he planned to reconcile it all before anyone noticed, she added. That's not reconciliation, I said softly. That's concealment. She didn't argue. That was the shift. The golden child was no longer defending automatically. She was listening. He asked if you'd settle, she said. Settle how? He'd repay the estate if you stopped cooperating publicly. There it was, the offer, the quiet exchange, silence for repayment. I felt the old instinct flicker, the one trained to smooth things over, to avoid public fracture. But then I remembered the kitchen table, the red circles, the affidavit, the amendment. The routed transfers. No, I said calmly. She inhaled sharply. You're not even considering it? I'm considering what this teaches, I replied. If it disappears quietly, it teaches that documentation only matters until repayment is convenient. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that landed deeper than I expected. I don't want my future kids thinking this is normal. Neither did I. After we hung up, I opened the boundaries document again. It felt closer now. Not as a threat, as a necessity, because accountability without boundary is just a moment. Boundary makes it sustainable. The next hearing date was set for the end of the month, 2 weeks, again. But this time, the stakes weren't just discrepancy, they were direction of funds. Intent inferred from flow. That night my mom called, her voice was trembling. He says you could still fix this, she said. How? I asked. By telling the media you misunderstood. I let the silence answer that. That he says families shouldn't destroy each other over money. This isn't about money, I said quietly. It's about control. She didn't respond because somewhere, even she knew. When someone reroutes $62,000 through a personal LLC, it's not confusion, it's decision. Before bed, I received one last message. Unknown number. Thank you for not settling quietly. We found discrepancies too. Plural. Discrepancies. Ripples becoming waves. The third climax was building now, not in emotion, but in inevitability. Because once patterns are mapped, they don't unmap. And Joseph had moved from denial to amendment to justification to quiet negotiation, each step narrowing his ground. The next hearing wouldn't just ask whether the affidavit was inaccurate, it would ask whether the routing of funds was authorized. And if the answer was no, the narrative wouldn't collapse, it would crystallize, in record, in court, in public memory, and there would be no quiet version left to retreat into. Part 27. The second hearing felt different from the first. The first had been about words, what Joseph said under oath versus what the bank records showed. This one was about flow, direction, intent mapped through timestamps. The courtroom was fuller this time, not packed, but fuller. A few familiar faces from church, two people I recognized from Megan's previous segments. A man I'd never seen before who kept glancing at Joseph with something between confusion and betrayal. The forensic accountant took the stand first. Calm, methodical, no theatrics. She projected a timeline onto a screen. Colored arrows traced money from Aunt Evelyn's checking account into the consulting LLC, from the LLC into Joseph's mortgage account, from there to a credit card payment, then another transfer back into the LLC 2 weeks later. It's not uncommon for funds to move between accounts, Joseph's attorney began. That's correct, the accountant replied evenly, but authorization and purpose matter. She pointed to a highlighted date. On April 14th, $5,200 left Miss Harris's account labeled temporary adjustment. That same day, $5,200 was deposited into Garcia Consulting LLC. 48 hours later, $4,900 was applied to Mr. Garcia's mortgage. The room felt still. Is there documentation indicating Miss Harris authorized this transfer? The judge asked. No, the accountant said. Joseph's attorney stood. Could it have been verbal authorization? The accountant paused. I review documentation. There is no record of authorization attached to these transactions. Then the judge looked at Joseph. Mr. Garcia, do you have written authorization from Miss Harris permitting these transfers? Joseph shifted in his seat. She trusted me, he said. The judge didn't blink. That is not the question. Silence. No, he said finally. There it was. Not misunderstanding, not clerical error, no authorization. The ADA stood briefly again. Our office notes that the pattern of routing through a business entity complicates the explanation of reimbursement. Complicates. Understatement of the year. Joseph's defense tried one more pivot. He intended to reconcile the funds before the estate was finalized. The judge leaned forward slightly. Intent to reconcile does not substitute for consent. Consent. That word again. It had followed this entire case like a quiet drumbeat. Charlotte sat rigid in the second row. My mom stared at the floor. I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not relief. Recognition. Because for years I had been told I was dramatic, sensitive, jealous. Now in a fluorescent-lit courtroom, the narrative had no adjectives, just arrows, just amounts, just absence of authorization. The judge spoke carefully. Based on the forensic review and the absence of documented authorization, the court orders full restitution to the estate, pending further civil review. Additionally, this court formally refers findings regarding the routed transfers to the district attorney for evaluation. There it was, not just discrepancy now. Findings, referred. Formal language doesn't shout, it lands. Joseph's shoulders dropped slightly, not in surrender, but in recalculation. He turned toward me as the hearing adjourned. You could still stop talking, he said under his breath as we passed in the aisle. I'm not talking, I replied quietly. The records are. Outside, the reporters were less tentative this time. Miss Jones, do you feel vindicated? Someone asked. Vindicated. Such a loud word. No, I said calmly. I feel heard. That was closer to the truth. Because vindication implies satisfaction. What I felt was steadiness, justice through receipts. Not revenge, not spectacle. Process. As I walked toward the parking lot, Charlotte caught up with me. I didn't know, she said. I know. She looked like she wanted to say more. Instead, she asked, what happens now? Restitution, I said, and whatever the DA decides. She nodded slowly. He keeps saying he was protecting everyone, she whispered. From what? I asked gently. She didn't answer because the answer was control. That evening, the news segment aired with updated graphics showing the routed transfers. No dramatic music, just arrows. The headline read, "Court orders restitution, transfers routed through LLC." My phone buzzed constantly, some messages supportive, some stunned. One from a former client of Joseph's. "We're reviewing everything." Ripples, widening. But this was the crest, the third climax. Not explosive, not violent, just undeniable. Because once a court labels transfers unauthorized, narrative loses its leverage. That night, after the noise settled, I opened the boundaries document again. It felt ready now, not reactive, proactive, because accountability without boundary invites repetition, and I wasn't going back to invisible. The next chapter wouldn't be about hearings. It would be about what happens after the record is set, when apologies are offered or not, when restitution is paid or contested, when family members decide whether to repair or retreat. And I knew one thing with absolute clarity: even if every dollar was repaid, trust would not be. And the final act of this story wouldn't be written in court. It would be written at my kitchen table, on my terms. Part 28, restitution sounds clean when a judge says it. In reality, it's paperwork, timelines, liquidation of accounts, quiet meetings with lenders. It's not cinematic, it's administrative. Within a week of the second hearing, Daniel confirmed that an initial payment had been made back into the estate. Partial, he said, from the LLC's remaining balance. How much, I asked. $27,000. I did the math in my head, not even half. The rest, I asked. He's negotiating asset liquidation, mortgage refinancing, probably, maybe a line of credit, maybe selling something he'd hoped no one would question. It struck me then, this wasn't just a financial unraveling. It was an identity shift. Joseph had always been the advisor, the steady one, the man people trusted with numbers. Now he was the one being audited. That night, he emailed me directly, not through counsel, not copied to anyone. Subject line, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. He didn't apologize, he explained. He said he had been under pressure, that he had intended to replace the funds before the estate was reviewed, that the LLC was a temporary mechanism, that the media had distorted nuance. I read the email twice. There was one sentence that stood out. "You've always been sensitive to fairness. I didn't think you'd escalate this." Sensitive. There it was again, a subtle repositioning. Not wrong, just emotional. Not factual, just reactive. I closed the email and opened the boundaries document. Then I copied it into a reply. I edited carefully, removed sharp edges, kept clarity. I wrote, "You are not to request involvement in my personal milestones, wedding, career events, future children, unless explicitly invited. You are not to contact me outside of email for the next 90 days. You are not to interfere in my private life or attempt to reframe public documentation as misunderstanding in conversations involving me. If you wish to repair anything, it begins with accountability, not explanation." I read it 3 times. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was containment. Then I hit send. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Charlotte, he's furious," she said. "I expected that. He says you're cutting him off. I'm setting terms. He says family doesn't do that." I leaned back against my couch. Family also doesn't reroute $62,000 without consent. Silence. Then she sighed. "He says you're humiliating him again." "I'm not posting anything," I replied calmly. "I'm responding privately." That was the difference now. I wasn't reactive. I was measured. Later that evening, Mom called. "He feels like you've exiled him," she said softly. "I gave him a path," I said. "Email, accountability, respect." "He thinks 90 days is extreme. It's space," I replied. There was a pause. "He's not used to you setting rules," she said. Neither was I. That was the truth. Growing up, I adjusted, accommodated, stayed quiet to keep peace. Now, peace required boundary. The next morning, Megan called. "There's a new development," she said. "What now?" I asked. "A local financial literacy nonprofit issued a statement encouraging families to document intra-family transfers." I blinked. "That's good?" I said slowly. "Yes," she replied. "Your case is being referenced as an example of why documentation matters." I sat very still. It wasn't about Joseph anymore. It was about pattern interruption. Justice through receipts. Not just in my family, in others. By afternoon, another partial restitution payment cleared. Smaller this time, but real. Daniel confirmed the estate would likely be made whole within 2 months if liquidation proceeded as planned. Financial closure, but emotional? That's slower. That evening, I received one more email from Joseph. Short, cold. I will comply with your conditions under protest. Under protest. Even in compliance, resistance. But compliance nonetheless. I didn't reply. 90 days begins with silence. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stood quietly in doorways while Charlotte's achievements were celebrated louder. The one who packed overnight bags to stay with Aunt Evelyn because you're better with details. The invisible one. It's strange how invisibility turns into vigilance, and vigilance, when documented, becomes protection. The story wasn't over. Restitution wasn't complete. The ADA hadn't announced next steps, but something had shifted permanently, not just in Joseph, in me, because I no longer needed to prove I belonged in the room. The record had done that. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, authority, quiet, grounded, mine. But the world outside wasn't done yet. Because when stories like this surface, they don't disappear quietly, they circulate. And 2 days later, one of them would land on the front page of the local paper, with my name in it. Part 29. The article went live at 6:12 a.m. I know the exact time because my phone buzzed while the sky was still gray, and I was half awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I'd slept. Charlotte's name lit up my screen. "It's out," she said when I answered. Her voice sounded small. I sat up and opened the link she texted. The headline was steady, not sensational. Local court orders restitution after unauthorized transfers in family estate case. No dramatic adjectives, no loaded language, just facts. There was a photo of the courthouse, a smaller inset photo of me walking down the steps after the hearing. I looked calm, smaller than I felt, determined in a way that surprised me. They quoted the judge, "Intent to reconcile does not substitute for consent." They quoted the forensic accountant. They quoted the ADA confirming the referral review. And then there was a paragraph about documentation, how years of preserved emails and statements clarified the case. Justice through receipts. They didn't frame me as vindictive. They described me as a family member who maintained detailed financial records while serving as caregiver. Caregiver. That word hit differently in print. Not invisible, not difficult. Caregiver. Joseph's name appeared 3 times. Once in the headline subtext, twice in reference to the LLC. They included his statement through counsel. Mr. Garcia maintains the transfers were temporary and intended for reconciliation. Maintains. Present tense. Still holding the narrative together with fingertips. I scrolled further. At the bottom of the article, there was a short note. The case has prompted local nonprofits to encourage clearer documentation in intra-family financial arrangements. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about precedent, about caution, about transparency. I exhaled slowly. Charlotte was still on the line. "He's furious," she said again, but this time it sounded less defensive. "He thinks you leaked things." "I didn't," I said. "I know." There was a pause. Mom hasn't stopped crying. That one landed heavier. Not because I felt guilty, but because grief doesn't follow logic. She wasn't crying over money. She was crying over identity collapse, over the loss of the version of Joseph she believed in. "Has he said anything else?" I asked. "He says the media is ruining his business." I thought about that. No one had fabricated anything. The records were accurate. The court findings were public. Truth doesn't ruin reputations. Behavior does. But I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I asked gently, "How are you?" Charlotte hesitated. "I don't know who he is right now." Honest. That was new. Later that morning, my inbox filled again. Just some messages from strangers thanking me for speaking up. One from a woman who wrote, "I thought I was crazy for keeping screenshots. I'm not anymore. I stared at that message for a long time." Because that was it. That was the undercurrent of this entire story. Not money, not drama, validation. When someone tells you for years that your concerns are exaggerated, you start to doubt your own memory. Documentation becomes sanity. Around noon, Daniel called. "The ADA is still reviewing," he said. "No formal charges yet." I figured, but restitution is proceeding on schedule. Progress, measured, administrative, still real. In the afternoon, I got a notification from a photography client, a simple email. "Saw the article. I respect how you handled it. We'd like to book you again." Life continuing, not collapsing. Joseph sent one more email that evening, shorter than the last. This is destroying everything I built. I read it twice. He didn't mention the transfers, didn't mention consent, didn't mention restitution. Everything he built, as if structures crumble on their own, as if foundations aren't part of the equation. I didn't respond. 90 days. Email only. Measured silence. That night, I drove past Aunt Evelyn's old house. It was dark now, listed for sale, lawn trimmed by a company instead of by me. I parked across the street for a minute. I thought about the evenings I'd spent there balancing spreadsheets after she fell asleep. Not because I was planning a courtroom moment, but because something felt off. I didn't want to accuse. I wanted clarity. Turns out clarity requires evidence, and evidence requires patience. The house looks smaller now, or maybe I was just standing differently. When I got home, my phone buzzed again, a notification from the paper. They'd posted a follow-up editorial. The headline preview read, "When documentation protects the invisible family member." Invisible. They used the word. I didn't open it, not yet, because something inside me needed a quiet moment before absorbing what the world thought of our story. Justice through receipts, soft boundaries, restitution in progress, narrative corrected. But family was still recalibrating. And tomorrow, I'd find out just how fractured that recalibration really was. Part 30. The editorial ran the next morning. I opened it at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I didn't remember making. The headline was simple, but it carried weight. "When documentation protects the invisible family member." The writer didn't name Charlotte, didn't speculate about motives, didn't turn it into a spectacle. It focused on patterns, how often the responsible one in a family becomes the quiet administrator, the one who tracks medications, pays bills, keeps copies, the one who gets called dramatic for asking for clarity. They quoted a local financial counselor, "Documentation isn't hostility, it's protection." I read that line 3 times. Protection. Not attack, not revenge. Protection. There was a paragraph about how difficult it can be to challenge a respected family figure. How power inside families is often informal but deeply entrenched. How transparency can feel like betrayal to those who benefit from opacity. Opacity. That word felt surgical. At the bottom, the writer ended with this: "Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a folder, a timeline, and the courage to say, 'Show me the authorization.'" I closed my laptop slowly. For years, I'd been told I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive to fairness, that I didn't understand how adults handle things. Now the language had shifted, not because I argued louder, because I had receipts. My phone buzzed before I could sit with that. "Mom." I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was tired. "I read it," she said. "I figured." There was a long pause. "He feels like everyone thinks he's a criminal." "I never called him that," I replied evenly. "I know." Another pause. "But the word unauthorized," she said softly. "It sounds so harsh." I leaned back in my chair. "Mom, it's accurate. Accuracy isn't cruel. It just doesn't cushion." She exhaled shakily. "He keeps saying he was trying to keep everything afloat. With Aunt Evelyn's money?" I asked gently. Silence. Then quieter. "I don't know what to believe anymore." That was the fracture. Not anger, not defense. Uncertainty. "I'm not asking you to choose," I said. "I'm asking you to look at the documents." She didn't argue. That felt like progress. Later that afternoon, Charlotte texted me a screenshot. Joseph had posted something vague on social media. "Sometimes the people you sacrifice for misunderstand the burden you carried alone." No names, no specifics, just implication. Victim language wrapped in abstraction. I stared at it. For a moment, the old instinct flared, the urge to respond, to clarify publicly, to defend myself again. Then I put my phone down. 90 days. Email only. No engagement with narrative spin. Boundaries aren't just rules for others, they're discipline for yourself. By evening, Megan called. "The story's getting regional pickup," she said. "Nothing national, but it's circulating." "Okay. How are you holding up?" I looked around my apartment. Quiet, ordered, mine. "I'm steady," I said. And I meant it. Because the climax wasn't the court, it wasn't the article, it wasn't even restitution. It was this. I no longer felt invisible. Not because strangers were reading about me, but because I had shown up for myself. That night, I updated the spreadsheet one last time. Restitution balance reduced again. Timeline, complete through court order. Folder, archived, not deleted. Archived, there's a difference. Before bed, I checked my email. One new message. From Joseph. Subject line, understood. That was it. No explanation, no protest this time. Just 2 words in the body. I will respect your conditions. I read it carefully. No qualifiers. No but. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't transformation, but it was acknowledgement of boundary. Sometimes that's the first crack in denial. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights. Outside, somewhere in town, people were reading about documentation and consent and invisible daughters. Inside, my life was quiet, uncertain, open. The ADA still hadn't announced whether formal charges would follow. The restitution wasn't fully complete. Joseph's business future was unclear. Mom was still grieving a version of him that might never return. Charlotte was suspended between loyalty and awakening. And me? I was no longer waiting to be told I belonged in the room. The thin envelope had started it. The heavy truth had carried it. What comes next isn't a courtroom scene. It's holidays, birthdays, maybe one day, a wedding invitation, with or without conditions attached. Maybe children who grow up understanding that show me the authorization isn't disrespect, it's wisdom. The news cycle will move on. Another story will replace ours. But the record exists now, and records don't forget. The ending isn't neat, it's real. Somewhere between restitution and reconciliation, between silence and repair, between family and fact. And tomorrow, when I wake up, I'll still have the receipts. But for the first time in my life, I won't need them to prove I'm here.